Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Murasaki in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56, One Hit and One Miss. Running amidst the cradle of trees, he saw rain's traces on the ground, slick, glistening spots round the stones. A sudden puff of wind made the forest shush in unison again, swiftly followed by a cascade of leaves, a futile protest of their limbs. His eyes caught sight of the man standing with his back to him, and he slowed down his running immediately. He puffed and blew and reached to his back to pull out that water bottle. Leaf's erratic weather did not suit him. Leaves crunched beneath his well-used sandals, its strap barely hanging there, and the man in front slowly turned around. He had the same childlike and clever mien, though his eyes had a hint of impish joy that threatened to spill over to the rest of his face. Presently, he was holding a white hawk in his hands. "I thought ya liked animals," he said as he made his way around the man, his eyes fixed on the bird that was calm as a sleeping babe in his hands. "If ya use Kai's genjutsu on it, it'll buy the farm in a jiffy." "You mean, Suzuki?" "I'm not," Suzuki said, his Sharingan flaring to life as he looked deeply into the hawk's tiny eyes. "It'll shake off the genjutsu as soon as it makes its presence known above their camp. It might stall for a split second, but it'll recover swiftly." Suzuki brushed his thumbs against the feathers, stroked the head gently, and watched as the golden threads in its irises bled red. At this sudden invasion, its heart reacted loudly for a moment, but the genjutsu's veil, which he had thrown on its innocent mind, darkened its senses too soon. It stared back at his eyes mechanically, enchanted by their red glow. Then, as soon as Suzuki slackened his grip, it flew away to the camp as though it knew in its heart to be that place where it wished to go. "That does it," Suijitsu said and took one noisy sip from the bottle again, eyes looking into the direction of the bird. It had disappeared behind the tall cliffs to the east. "Did you bring it?" Suzuki asked and turned around to face him. Excitement had made his cheeks, ears, neck a bit red. His eyes had cooled down like the summer's breeze at night, but victory's delightful touch still hovered there, insistent. He had beaten Itake, and it was making his heart dance with joy. He would get what he wanted today, and his brother would not know a thing. Suijitsu reached to his back, pulled out a scroll, and tossed it at him. Suzuki caught it and wasted no moment in unrolling it to summon the things he needed. He sat down and spread it on the wet ground and then pressed his thumb between his teeth to injure the skin there. A tiny bubble of blood popped out from the wound, and he pressed it against the scroll's surface and created a red streak towards the symbols. A bag instantly appeared on the scroll. It was a small one he carried on long missions with himself. He craned his stern face at Suijitsu and spoke, "Your clone isn't goofing off out there, is he? I cancelled the pretty lil thin before I came here to romance ya," he said and bent down to pull out a white root mask. Its mouth was shaped like a monkey, with crimson streaks running round the eyes. Suzuki stood up and strapped the common root sword to his back. The rays spilt out from between the tree's limbs and touched the ground as distorted lights. The sun was a little kind to them today. He made hand seals, and, immediately, a copy of himself appeared before him. His Sharingan sang to the tune of his heart whilst he looked into his doppelganger's eyes and touched the neck's bare skin, feeding him his own chakra. It raced through it, imbuing it with a power it would not otherwise possess, and planted images in its head. It had to go along perfectly. One little mistake would ruin everything. Suijitsu did the same and watched as a bubble of water took his form, a toothy grin spreading across its pasty face. "Me lad airs jolly, unlike yas," Suijitsu said and stepped back whilst cupping his chin as if he was surveying his artistry. Suzuki heard a bird's song drift to them from somewhere, and a cool air followed in its wake. The wind was flowing in from the north. It would rain soon. A battle would be fought in a muddy bog close to the outpost. Suzuki flicked his head to indicate that the clone had to go. It did not speak and rushed off in the direction of the meeting place with the other one. Suzuki looked back to Suijitsu, eyes fire-struck inside Sharingan's menacing light, face alight with an expression that made Suijitsu's body tingle with a bad fear. "Put the seal on my shoulder," Suzuki commanded and pulled his sleeve up. Suijitsu stepped forward and made quick hand seals, and then he tapped Suzuki's shoulder once. "I am alone with a pretty lad under the trees," he said and pulled out a tag from his pocket and plastered it against Suzuki's skin. "Ya know what folks say, 'bout two men bane all alone in the forest? What do they say?" Sasuke asked and touched his shoulder to look at the ink as it seeped into his skin, and within moments, the tag disappeared. Folks say many things, lad, but they call 'em queers. He said and pressed the silky white mask over his face. Let's touch each other, but let's touch each other gingerly. Can't let go of this funny stuff you picked up from Rain, huh? Say something like this in front of Nii-sama, and you'll be in for a surprise, he said, and he, too, pressed the mask over his face. It rippled and slowly took the form of another face. Then he took out the fox mask from the bag and turned it around. Yeah, mental? Like hell I will. Hey, why do I get a monkey one? That's fair. Suijutsu protested and put the mask on grudgingly. You said that you're the jolly one, Sasuke replied and created a smile on a different face that was covered in the shadows of leaves above them. Sasuke made few hand seals and the bag disappeared again. He spat out a little spark of fire and the scroll burnt to ashes by his feet. He turned around and Suijutsu followed. Suddenly, he stopped by a stream, his eyes looking at the slick stones that lay at the bottom, covered in fungal layers. Sasuke turned his head and spoke, "Make another one." Why? Suijutsu asked, stopping. The sun had momentarily broken through the clouds and it was hot on his skin. For a moment, sunlight bounced off a silver stone in the water and blinded him. He did not like where this was going. Do it, we're running out of time, Sasuke said, and there was an angry note in his voice. Suijutsu did not complain. He knew the hand seals by heart, so using the stream as a water source this time, he created another clone of himself and watched him mimic his worried expression. It rose out from water and attained a perfect shape in moments. What now? Suijutsu asked and looked from the clone's face to the dark, strange eyes behind the fox mask. The Sharingan was in a deep slumber. Sasuke could awaken it if he wished, but he had no reason. Then a different contempt color came from their depths and consumed the blue irises that, for a moment, Suijutsu thought he saw the trick of Sasuke's favorite toy in his eyes. It was gone. Find Sakura when the battle starts, he whispered in a somewhat hoarse voice that was not his and bent his head forward to peer into the unfamiliar shade upon Suijutsu's eyes. Bring her to me at the shrine. Spin a story of an injured teammate. I want to end this today. Then he turned around and started running towards the outpost. Suijutsu breathed out a loud sigh and spoke to his clone in a hushed and worried voice, his eyes darting back and forth between the two. He did not know who to obey, the younger precocious one, the older sinister one. He was caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, and he was sure as Yomi that he would land in hot water either way. Kai stared at the flowers tossing in the wind. It had gained strength and was cooler than usual. He raised his gaze slightly when Sasuke came into view from behind the trees. The mischievous man from Rain was right behind him. His customary grin gave him the aspect of a man who always had a terrible thought on his mind. It took you a while to get back, Kai remarked and watched as a tiny frown appeared in the center of Sasuke's forehead. If you're so quick on your feet, you could have done it. I'm sure Nii-sama would be happy, Sasuke said, appearing as frigid as the weather, which he loved. The red patches on Sasuke's skin gave him a strange mask of momentary passions. He almost looked shy. Kai did not say anything in answer. Sasuke was a difficult youth, and any quarrel between them would upset Itachi. It was best to leave him be. Kai lifted his gaze slightly, and his Sharingan rose to the surface to look beyond the trees. He could not see Itachi's chakra anywhere. His eyes returned to Sasuke's blank face. He did not seem all that worried. Where's Itachi-sama's crow? He asked and looked from the sharp teeth shining in Suijutsu's mouth to the trees again. Nothing. The crow had vanished. I don't know. I'm not its keeper, he said, and this time, a smile disturbed his unfriendly countenance to soften the scowl. He was being mischievous. Kai could tell. Kai turned around to face him fully. This would land him into a lot of trouble. His eyes roved towards the tree again and many sounds poured into his ears, but he could not hear the crow's sounds. Did you do something to the bird, Sasuke? Did you? He asked in a voice that was molded by worry and took a step forward to grab hold of Sasuke's shoulders. His palms were sweating profusely now. Sasuke slightly turned his eyes and head and looked at Kai's fingers gripping his shoulder. Then he directed his gaze back to the man he could not say he was ever fond of. Kai was too servile, a nasty sycophant in his eyes. Sasuke had no idea what his brother ever saw in him, but he knew that Itachi gave Kai his post in Umbu to get him off his back. He would soon learn what it meant to be unfair. I told you, he broke off, bending his head forward, eyes coming alive with a glint. I don't know where it is. Go on a goose chase if you want. I'm not looking for it. Kai was still staring keenly at the shadows of many leaves lying upon Sasuke's right cheek when a flare rose up high into the sky. It lit up that portion with a deep red invasion. He let go of Sasuke's shoulders and frantically looked at the outpost that was not that far from their location. It was under attack. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fingers into a hard fist. This was too convenient. He did not know how to lay the blame on Sasuke. It was no use. Kai looked over his shoulder and tried to see beneath the mask of composure, but Sasuke was as roguish as ever. Let's go, Kai said, voice barbed with distrust, and started running towards the smoke plumes rising up into the sky. Sasuke looked at Suigetsu, exchanging a mischievous smile with him, and ran behind Kai into the smoke the wind was pushing in their direction. Wind brought noises of metal clashing against metal and roars of shinobis to them. He shrouded himself under the mantle of shadows and bushes, watching as their clones ran towards the outpost that lay in ruins. It was not their business. Sasuke adjusted his mask and flicked his head to indicate to Suigetsu that they had to move. The bandits were advancing, and they did not have much time on their hands to mess this up. They sped through the noise and smoke, running over water in the ridges that were immersed and slippery and muddy with rainwater. Clouds were moving inwards, bringing in an earthy scent that overpowered the flammable powder's stench that refused to lift. The rain was soft at first, but then it turned heavy as it flattened the grass and dug up the ground. Sasuke and Suigetsu powered through, rain splattering against their masks. Their heels dug into the ground with a purpose, the chakra there keeping their footing secure and firm. At last, they arrived at the next outpost. It was a mess. Guts and blood of many shinobis had become a fertilizer for the ground. It stank to Sage's heaven. He looked around and found no one alive. His Sharingan broke through the chakra barriers set across his eyes. It burned into the film for a moment to take a peek at his surrounds. Arms and legs lay strewn about like discarded doll's pieces. Rain's present gentleness allowed the big flies to swarm about them. Few men appeared from behind the wooden tower that was still burning in some places. It had been set alight with crude oil. Sasuke reached up and dug his fingers under the mask's layer and pulled it off with the Umbu one. Suigetsu did the same and stepped forward to stand beside him. These masks did not have enough chakra to last through any battle. They needed to save them for Toruin. The burly one in front stopped at the sight of Sasuke, and the nasty grin on his face spread wider, revealing uneven yellow teeth and black gums. He was tall, about 7 feet Sasuke imagined, and carried the largest axe he had ever seen in an iron grip. It was like a red guillotine. His breast was wide and big and riddled with green veins he could count easily without Sharingan. The 4 men behind him came to a halt, 2 standing on his either side now like a little army. Sasuke smelled the fetid reek they exuded. The bandits had played him. He had never ordered them to attack any other outpost, but they had their own plans. It did not matter, he would bury these last ones here and offer a prayer of gratitude at the Uchiha shrine later. This place would be their grave. Well, look here, lads, he said in a loud, rough voice. Didn't know Konoha had lovely things who posed as shinobi. The men behind him started their wild and uncontrolled hysterics as if he had shared the funniest joke in the world. Who sent you here? Sasuke asked, and his hand reached down to lock to the hilt. It was smoother than a babe's skin, a perfect pattern etched into its surface like a man's poetry on a scroll, a gift from his father. He kept it nice and clean, with love. Why does it matter, lovely? The village girl I'd caught didn't satisfy me, too tiny for me cock. She ran away with pissin', blood leaking down her thighs. Whore. Was looking around for a feisty one to take to me bed tonight, think you'd do fine. Make me last one look like a one-eyed crone, you do. And she was a pretty thin, too, he said and touched the large prayer beads around his neck. His veins bulged and twitched and he turned red in the face as he let out another loud laugh simply out of necessity. He looked at his companions for approval, and they joined in the laughter. Did Meru send you to attack the outposts? Suzuki asked, and the man's laughter trailed into silence at the sight of sherry non shining in the velvet-like mist. The stones I'd given him are in your pocket. I want them back. He didn't keep his promise. They had killed all the men in the outpost, fondled women, they were not to be trifled with, it was best to end this here, now. His face twisted and warped, and he swung his axe once through the air, clove it clean through as thought it were a cloth. Be silent, lil' boy, or I'll put somethin' you don't like where you don't want it, he rasped, spit trailing down his chin as he grabbed the large axe's handle with his other hand to hold it in an offensive stance. He wanted a sherry non, you see one from the battlefield. I'll give I'm yours. And if you live after I pluck em out of your lovely face, I'll sell you off to the famous whorehouse, round air for some more stones. But not before I'm through with you. Fucking thugs. Suzuki wanted to say out loud, clichés from a common children's tale his Oba-san read out to him when he was a boy child, yet he chose not to voice his thoughts. Bloody hell. Quit slobberin', ya big, loony faggot. Suijitsu said and let out an amused chuckle. Hand over the stones and we might let ya live. Let's not make it messy, eh? He curled his fingers around the hilt of his small blade and broke the illusion that was placed upon it. It rippled and turned into the executioner's blade right before their eyes. He took it out of its sheath and poised to strike. The man let out an enraged roar, his neck muscles swollen and bloated like ship ropes. I'll get both of ya whores. He stopped mid-sentence, and his voice vanished into the wind. His watery eyes widened, and the axe slipped from his hands and thudded to the ground. Long pronounced cuts appeared in his neck, torso, and arms. His face contorted in pain and big bubbles of blood popped out of each cut as he gasped out his final breath. His big, round, shining head tipped to the left and tore itself off his neck and fell into the mud. He went down like a big log, splashing mud everywhere, his head floating in the puddle beside him. Suzuki stood about 20 feet behind him. One by one, the heads of his boisterous companions fell down to their feet, their faces frozen in disbelief. Get the stones, Suzuki said and shook his sword twice to rid it of their blood. The ground was slippery with mud, blood, guts. He looked at the man's face once more, a flicker of disgust in his eyes, and then he looked at Suijitsu who had taken the pouch out of the man's pocket. Yeah, didn't have ta kill em like that, yeah no. I was talking mental notes as ta what he wanted ta do ta yeah, Suijitsu said and threw up the leather pouch into the air twice in delight. You didn't hear? You can get hands-on experience from the tea houses around Leaf. Suzuki stashed his sword away and squinted his eyes against a burst of wind that threw a rain spray against his face. Don't get nasty with me. I wanted it for the tumbles portion in that weekly entertainment scroll for women, he said and trailed behind Suzuki, walking against the wind by keeping his feet firm on the ground. Tumbles? He asked and moved through the lines of sunlight and shadows between the trees. It's a women's club in Mist. They like this queer shit cherry blossom Himes cocksuckers are nasty lil bitches. They send me hate scroll mails, bout me murderin', meself and fuckin', me mum and sister and I ain't got no fuckin' sister. Fuckin' loose cunts. I'm goin' ta kill the whore in the most violent way and that'll teach em a lesson. He rubbed his hands together and created a happy grin on his face. Whatever makes you happy, let's go, Suzuki said and pulled at the mask hanging from the jacket's side strap by a hook. Right behind ya, lovely. Suijitsu teased and put the mask back on, hiding his face and the sword's shape. They ran from the bloody scene and left the outpost behind. Their rendezvous point was not far from Leaf. They ran through the open gates and witnessed chaos. A small army of bandits had attacked Konoha, as well. Some people lay injured by the gates and were being healed by the medics. Smoke rose from the weapons depot behind the houses, but several Sutton users were already putting out the fire. The bandits had probably fanned out and were wreaking havoc. He firmed his hold on the hilt and looked ahead. Time was running out. These masks would be rendered useless in about an hour. He breathed in a hissing breath and spoke, "We have to find him. We're running out of time. I've sent him the scroll. He'll be waitin' for us by the stream outside the barrier." "Don't ya worry," Suijitsu assured and ran behind him. The buildings whooshed past them like colorful paintings. They killed several bandits who attacked them along the way. They were pillaging homes and raping women. He had underestimated Meru's propensity for violence. His men were swine. They did not care that children watched whilst they forced the women down beneath them, pulled up their kimonos, and fucked them raw and senseless on the roads. It was a banquet for these brutes, free women and loot. Meru had not kept his word. Whomever he was working for had asked for a sherry non-why. He did not know and did not have the time to care. Konoha's army was right at his heels. If he did not elude Kai here, everything would be lost. The lusty bandits scattered at the roaring sounds of flames launched into the sky. Uchiha men were amongst the front-line shinobis. He and Suigetsu took a detour and ran between the cramped houses, finding a foothold up on the walls and making their way up to the roofs. It started pouring down heavy and hard, and screeches of men rose up into the air as Konoha's shinobis pushed them back. It would be over soon. He had to find Torin and Sakura. And fast. Sasuke skidded to a halt when he found Suigetsu's clone standing by the infirmary. He looked to Suigetsu and spoke roughly, "Why is he there? Tell him to find her. We don't have time." "Calm yourself, Sasuke," he said, his voice hissing. All that running had drained him good. "She must be in the infirmary. She's a medic, yeah no." He ran his hand absent-mindedly across his mask as if he was wiping his forehead clean. "You better be sure. I can't risk using my Sharingan again, it'll damage the mask." He grated harshly and ran his eyes over the building as though he could see through the facade without the Sharingan. "I'll find her," Suigetsu assured and moved his mask a little to the side to take a quick sip of water. It was infused with a chakra rejuvenation powder, and fuck, he needed it bad right now. "Here, yeah, might need it." He held out the bottle, but Sasuke shook his head. "I took one along the way," he said and cast a glance to the side where Suigetsu's clone was still standing and then met Suigetsu's eyes. "Lead the way and bring her to the same spot. The barrier and the mess here will prevent Root from detecting any breach into her mind." Suigetsu nodded and made a long leap, clearing the 60 feet tall wall. Sasuke followed him, and they landed at the back of the weapons depot. A clear stream ran behind it. It came from a shrine deep in the forest. They ran upstream, leaving the din of battle and slaughter in their wake. The clone waited outside the infirmary. He stumbled forward when he caught sight of Suigetsu, but stopped when he saw Sasuke and him leap to the other side of the wall and muttered, "Original bastard. Thinks he's the shit? I'll murder him and take his place." At that moment, Kai came running to him with an injured man behind him, who was supported by 2 other men. A sword had sliced deep into his left side, and he was bleeding badly. As soon as Kai's eyes focused on him, he pulled in a deep breath and spoke, "Where's Sakura? This man needs help. Suigetsu left me here to keep watch. I haven't seen her, and the bastard there wouldn't let me in. He says the place is packed," he said in a jovial manner, pointing his thumb at the big and heavy guard standing at the door. Kai tilted his head to one side and looked at the man. "Let this man through, he's injured," Kai said loudly, and the burly man took 2 steps to climb down the stairs. His face was red and mean and he exhibited an angry scowl. "Who goes there? Lady Tsunade's left me in charge. The infirmary's crawling with Katsuya clones, and they're delicate little creatures. She's out on the front lines. I can't let anyone through without chakra identification," he said and locked his teeth as though he was about to prevent himself from letting out a long whining sound. "I'm Kai, commander of the 5th Squad of the Umbu Division," he said and made hand seals to make his chakra known to him. The man before him sensed his chakra and bowed. "Kai-san, forgive me, but it's standard protocol," he said and raised his shoulders on a loud sigh. "My Sharingan can see this man's chakra. He's a clone from Suigetsu, a man from Sasuke's squad," he said and gestured Suigetsu to come forward. "Take him in. I left my clone at the outpost. I need to go back. Send me a hawk if anything happens here." The man nodded and allowed Suigetsu to carry the man into the infirmary, with the masked Umbu. He climbed 2 stairs when Kai spoke again, "Tell her to come meet me by the gates as soon as she's done here. It's imperative that she does Sasuke's orders." Kai narrowed his red eyes on Suigetsu and spun away. Suigetsu watched him flash away through the smoke floating towards them from the buildings. He looked ahead and carried the grunting man to the 2nd floor, thinking, why would Sasuke demand her presence at the gates? Kai, a big fat liar, he thought. It made no sense, but he shrugged off the thought. It was better to listen to Kai. Itake. Various smells from many medicines hung thickly in the air. It was like a load carried by an old man who could barely carry it anymore. He saw Sakura packing a few things into a bag at the end of the large hall. A timid-looking medic came running forward, along with her 2 assistants, and took the man from his hands. They laid him down on the bed on his right and moved the curtain around him. Moans and grunts rose from behind the curtains and assistant medics carried bloody swathes of bandages and trays all around him. Suijitsu looked curiously at Sakura. She did not seem that perturbed by everything happening around her. A medic went to her, and she told her something with a fake smile on her lips. Her greens, turned meek by distress, wandered in his direction and the smile faded immediately. He bit his lower lip and stalked towards her, and suddenly, her expression looked as though a rabbit had been caught in a trap and was about to be slaughtered on the sword. "Suijitsu, what are you doing here?" she asked and strapped the fanny bag around her waist. She was a little nervous. There was a curl of anxiety in her smile, and he realized that she was up to no good. "Kai came by," he said in a chirpy voice, boring his eyes into hers. "You needed at the gates." "Suzuki's orders." "Suzuki-kun-'s?" she asked, and her face crumpled in a frown as frustration pinked her cheeks. She cursed inwardly at the little slip-up as she had stopped using an affectionate honorific for him about a year back. At least, she tried her hardest not to. "Yamato-san's called me to the forest. Tsunade-sama needs me. I'll send in Shizune-san to assist him. I can't neglect Hokage-sama's orders. I'm sure he'd understand." She clenched her teeth together as if she was on the verge of speech, but she did not say anything more and rushed out of the infirmary. He decided to follow her, but he had not made it far out of the gates when he lost the strength and turned into water. The mist outside Konoha was light, rain, gentle. A lovely scent from lilies saturated the air, leading their way to the shrine's heart. They ran some more and came across Torin, who was waiting by a guardian deity statue for them. His goggles were fogged by the cold, and he looked quite irritated and confused. He sneezed thrice, and his nose turned as red as an overripe berry. Mucus splattered out of his right nostril, and he wiped at it without any shame. Suzuki had never felt a disgust so sudden in his entire life. The fish he had had this morning was already beginning to churn in his stomach. "Took your sweet time, Tabata," he said groggily and wiped a hand across his goggles. It wasn't easy to shake off Umbu. "They're persistent," Suzuki said in a changed voice and started walking to the shrine. His walk progressed to a jog, and he disappeared behind the large stones. The shrine was not far. Of all the days, this was the day the Uchiha bastard picked up to meet someone. "I'll fuck him up for this." He groaned and chased after Suzuki, with Suijitsu right behind him. Mist grew thick and rain thinned. A mellowed sound floated outwards from the shrine. It came up from an empty well the monks used in the past. This place had fallen to neglect. Moss grew on the spires and Buddha statues, and the deity statues lay broken under the constant lashes of rain. Torin felt a tingling sensation run down his body. He was sensing through his bugs, and he had crossed Konoha's barrier. He was vulnerable. Where was the fool leading him? He wrapped his arms around his shoulders and rubbed his skin. He hated autumn and its warmth-sapping condition. It made him sick, and his nose got runny like a sickly genin kid's no one liked to sit with. He hated it. He followed Tabata's shadow as it twisted through the stray light beams, Kamiya trailing behind it. He breathed in the woody scent and spoke, "Have you set up the traps for him? He won't go down easy. As soon as he succumbs to poison, we'll slit his throat and take his eyes. Danzo-sama needs them. He'll deal with Itake when he returns. We'll say that the bandits killed him." He coughed and stopped, trying to look ahead into the light as Tabata turned around. He could not see Tabata's body, a dark figure in his gaze. "Why did you?" in a shaking breath closed the sentence. Torin saw the sherry non burn through the film on the mask, and the little insects vibrated in his bones like hungry gnats at the scent of the powerful chakra. Torin did not even see him move when a kick crashed into his ribs. His breath flew from his lungs, and he went flying back and skidded and rolled on the muddy ground like a toy. Eventually, he rolled slowly and his body stopped moving. He tried to get up, but he felt that several of his ribs were broken. He balanced himself on his elbows, straightening his battered torso as his slim muscled legs tried to lift him off the ground. It was hopeless. He slowly craned his face, streaked in mud, to Sasuke as he landed on his feet right before him. "How are you doing, Torun?" Sasuke asked and created the loveliest smile on his young face. His mask was gone, and his white sweetened skin glowed in the light like that of a no-theater child's mask. "Danzo's not paying you enough for your hard work. That dog." Suijutsu cackled behind him as he took his mask off to drag in a deep breath that swelled his breast. "The air out air's good," he said and spread his arms out wide and spun around like a little boy. "Other than ya stinkin' up the place, ya rude bitch." Torun bowed his head and then looked back up again. "What do you want?" he asked and watched anger's sinister color glow prominently in Sasuke's eyes, a new pattern, and he saw the uncaring eyes change into their eternal, petal-like forms. Then the pattern disappeared and devolved back into commas. Sasuke was playing with him and he resented it, but he did not have the strength and the power in him to take Sasuke on. "What's this about the eyes?" "Tell me, I like stories," Sasuke said and stood over Torun, looking down at him with an expression as if he was a street mendicant groveling by his feet. Torun laughed and created a defiant smirk on his bloodied lips. "You think it's that easy? You fool. You dragged me out of the barrier to read my mind, didn't you? It won't work. We have seals on our tongues and bodies. I can't speak anything and you can't break into my mind without giving yourself away." And he burst out laughing again, seeing no change in Sasuke's smile. "And they say you're a prodigy." Torun rasped as he tried to get up again. "No, you're a foolish boy with a good toy in his hands. You didn't think this through, did you? Now, I'll just walk out of here and you will be arrested for treason against Root. I'd love to see your crazy brother pull you out of this one." The smile vanished from Sasuke's face, and he coiled his leg back and hit Torun's forehead. His head snapped back, and he rolled across the ground and crashed into a tree. Blood poured out from his head and fell down on his hands in large ugly spatters. "Don't talk about Ni-sama like that," he warned and made to move when Suijutsu grabbed him by the shoulder. "Cool it, lad. Yeah, God, I'm good. The bastard's already bleedin'. Let's do what we came to do and be on our way. We ain't got time to be messin' round," Suijutsu reasoned and watched the anger slowly fade away from Sasuke's face and eyes. Torun clutched feebly at his head. He could barely see anything. He felt one of them slap the palm of his hand against his forehead. A strange feeling tore through him, and he was lifted off the ground high up into the air, and then the world was awash in red, filtered into hot tones that he wanted to spill out all his secrets before the Uchiha. Sharingan Genjutsu. How? He tried to fight it, but it was too late. He was already floating, and his lips were moving before he could stop them, so he spoke, words tumbling from his mouth. "Danzo gave a rare Sharingan to Yagura for something important. The host died mysteriously. He killed several people. Danzo. He. Speak." Sasuke said, his voice grave, and intensified the genjutsu. Torun looked up into the light pouring down from the sky. It was red. He did not understand what was going on, but he spoke again, without shame and honor. He wanted control of the host. Minato denied him. For the village. Yagura threw him out of the tulip squad. Namikaze fool. Then his words vanished into silence. He wheezed, unable to speak anymore. Sasuke unsheathed his sword and walked to him. He swished it through the air, slicing a dark cut into Torun's throat. Blood's arc flew from Torun's neck, and his body trembled and convulsed grotesquely before it went completely still. Sasuke knelt down and placed a seal on his forehead when it started raining. He turned around after giving one last look to Torun's broken goggles stained with his own blood. "Where's your clone? Why's he not here with Sakura?" he asked and looked about and saw no one for several hundred feet. Suijutsu gulped and stared fearfully into his eyes. "Me clone it vanished," he said, and Sasuke's expression changed from shock to fury. "What? I thought Sasuke stopped and frantically looked about. "Merge with water. Hurry, find her. If she's here, she couldn't be far." He frantically looked about, but it was hopeless. The seals were created to fool dojutsu users. The bloody shrine could be anywhere. Suijutsu knelt down and merged a part of his watery form with the water. He could feel everything the water touched: soft petals of lilies, slick plumes of birds in the trees, textures of trees, and the pores in a woman's skin. There! He shouted, and Sasuke flashed fast to the rocks on the right. There it was, the shrine hidden beneath the rocks. He shot his hand forward, and it turned into a Raiden spear that went clean through the stones as if they were not even there. He heard movement from inside, and he frantically moved the tip of the Raiden sword forward, pulled it back, and then stabbed it into the ground repeatedly till he heard a suppressed whimper from the other side. The roof of the little tunnel was caving in, and the rat was trying hard to squeeze its way through with its head intact. Then the sound vanished. He could hear nothing. Find her. Search this whole area. Now. Sasuke commanded roughly and flashed away. He went from one corner to the other, but found nothing. Finally, when he realized that it was all for naught, he compressed his lips and signaled to Kirin to call his clone away from Kai. Suijutsu came running from behind the rocks. He was out of breath. I can't find her. She's not air. It's like she vanished, reverse summoning. He informed and put his hand to his breast to get his wind. I'm going back to the village to end my Bunshin Jutsu. Follow me when you catch your breath, he said, and flashed away. Sun was low in the sky, and smoke was hanging in the air, like something dreadful, when he leapt over the wall behind the depot to land into the village. He saw his clone running towards the infirmary, and he cancelled it. It disappeared into a cloud of smoke right before his eyes. He placed his hand on the facade and looked down, gritting his teeth. He had messed up. Everything was ruined. She had got away somehow. He had to find her and kill her. It was the only way. There you are. A voice spoke, and he looked up to see Kai walking towards him. His jacket was frayed, and he looked quite tired. You ran off all of a sudden. Are you all right? Sasuke straightened his back and looked at the small cut on Kai's forehead. Where's Sakura? I need to talk to her, he said, and immediately, Kai's expression turned wary. I don't know. Suijutsu told me that she'd gone off to see Yamato. He called her somewhere outside the village Hokage business, he said, and surveyed Sasuke's calm face. He looked more composed than usual, and this demeanor was bothering him. What's on your? I have to get to the infirmary. Sasuke cut him off and flashed away so fast that Kai could not see the direction in which he ran. Kai called out from behind him, but he did not see him stop. He was in trouble. Shadows mounted the walls when Sakura climbed up the stairs of her apartment. It would be night soon. She could barely pull air into her lungs. She was tired and sad. Slowly, she opened her door and stepped inside her apartment. A familiar scent of something crashed against her senses like a cart. Her heart plunged into the depths, and she breathed in and out deeply thrice as though she was being fucked hard, yet it was only terror and a feeling of something a little more delicate. She spun around and found Sasuke sitting on her sofa. His Sharingan ascended, and she felt naked before his eyes. What are you doing here? Sakura asked, fumbling with words. Her cheeks were pinker now, and she felt sweat pouring down her back. Come here, Sakura, he rasped, watching her. Place your foot on my thigh. What? She asked in confusion, heart beating in her throat. Light flashed into the room and missed his face. It was cast in shadows. Damn it, she could not see his face, and it was horrifying her. Place your foot on my thigh now, he repeated again, a bit more roughly this time, and her heart skipped beats, clasped by fear's hard hand. Sasuke, I don't. I won't repeat myself again, he cut across her, and his eyes shone wildly in darkness. Sakura gulped down the thorny lump stuck in her throat and approached him with wobbly steps. It was as if he sat far away, and the distance was immeasurable for her feet that felt frail to carry her body. The new shadows made the bridge between them seem longer, harder to navigate. She found a bit of courage in her and stopped in front of him. Her eyes tried to see the fine lines of his face, but she could not. She reached down and pulled down the strap of her sandal. Then, carefully, she raised her foot and placed it on his left thigh. Sasuke's Sharingan dug into her skin, and, When his fingers touched her thigh, her hairs stood on ends, and she hissed despite herself. Goose flesh rose on her thighs, and she trembled under his touch, afraid as an animal left out in storm. He seemed unmoved. He moved his hand up and slowly unwound the cloth wrapped round her upper thigh. When he removed it, he looked at the deep cut and the blue skin around it. He touched it with his fingertip and pushed the bruised flesh inwards, and she winced in pain. "Suzuki, that hurts." Sakura protested and, with a sudden jerky movement, pulled her foot back down. She stumbled back but quickly regained her balance. "Where did you get that wound from?" Suzuki asked, and she felt electrifying terror make the tiny hairs on her skin tingle. Her legs trembled, and, as he stood up to his full height, she saw his dark, shapely shadow stand taller behind him, and for the first time, the difference between their stature was not pleasing to her girlish heart, but deeply disturbing. "On the field, what kind of question is that?" Sakura said, and she knew she sounded timid and afraid. He made her afraid, and that had never happened before. How long had she wanted for him to come to her, touch her, make love to her? Yet this was something different. There was fury, alive in his eyes, and she wanted to spin away and run. "Really? I thought you were a medic," he asked in a mocking tone, drawing closer, and she felt that she could not even move as panic settled deeply into her limbs, hindering her movement. All she could do was stand there and tremble. "S. Suzuki," she said, her voice a vibrating sound, fright choking out her throat. "Unless, your thigh was struck by Raiden. It paralyzes skin, muscle, tissue burns through it, and it doesn't heal for a while." "Right, Sakura," Suzuki whispered, his hand slowly going to his back as though he wanted her to see it move. She caught sight of the moonlight shining on the long kunau's tip, and she felt completely helpless. Quickly, tears gathered into her eyes, and she staggered back and tried to spin away, to run from him, but all the life had been ripped from her body. It had gone numb. Suzuki took one step towards her, appearing even taller than before, when the front door swung open to reveal Kai. He was breathing heavily. He looked from Suzuki to the quick movement of his hand. Kai's Sharingan could only catch a bit of his hand's swift movement. He had stashed away something, probably a weapon. He inhaled deeply to calm his heartbeats and spoke, "Come with me, Suzuki. You're required at the meeting." Suzuki cast Sakura one last appraising look, then his eyes filled deeply with a kind of malice, and he left the apartment silently with Kai, without an argument. Sakura heard the sound of the door closing behind her back, and she slumped down onto the floor, tears finally breaking through. She cried, hacking, body trembling, eyes looking to the empty spot where he had sat moments ago. He meant to kill her, he had really meant to kill her. Oh, Sage, Suzuki truly loathed her, for he knew what she was up to. Chapter 57, Double the Trouble. Bodies, a swarm of flies bearing down on men, but dead men had no tails. In silence they slept, and in silence they bore their lies. Once more, one more time, requiems never had a smile-less audience. Dead men, rank smells from rotting flesh accompanying the rain, its tunes discordant eager scavenger. It had come down early to dig deep into their skins, make them tender for the beaks in the morning. The odor was tar for his lungs, but he had learned to bear these things. They did not cause him distress anymore. Who would speak of their tales of war and murder if not him? He penned them, forged the final bits of their destinies in the manner of folk tales, of which swords would speak if granted spirits and tongues. The last they saw were the strikes from his blade. That was the only sensation they would carry to their graves if someone awarded them such a courtesy. Otherwise, they would become a delicacy for the crows and vultures, and he knew that they would sing in joy, with bellies full, and pick the dead to the bones out of love. Nature was a love letter for the dead, it had less songs for the living. "Itaki-sama, I believe, I've found what you were looking for," the unsure voice of his subordinate spoke from behind him. It carried over the rain's noise. Nature was impatient today. Sarizawa held a wooden box in his trembling hands. His fingers were white as a wet scroll's paper. Cold was never kind to him. It only took a fleeting glance of the sturdy black box to recognize it from the vast threads of his memories. A smile dangerously threatened to invade his face, but he did not allow it to tread that far. Itaka made the hand seals he had learned by heart in memory and watched as the chakra set the wolf marking alight like a children's magic show. The seal was broken. How easy it was to get what he wanted. It almost amused him. He turned on his sherry non and looked through the wooden barrier that was not enough to hide anything from his eyes. There it was. That prize he had been playing for. 2 whole days had gone by in these games. The letters from Konoha had stopped coming. He placed his hand on the wood and his fingers clenched with unease, which grew less mild. His crows were gone. It was no use. He could make more and send one to Konoha, but a storm was pushing inwards from that direction. His crow did not have the strength in its wings to power through. He admitted that he had lost in one of these games. Was it Kikyo? He would not put it past her. Was it Suzuki? The child had always been precocious and heedless. The time to lay the blame on either one of them was gone. He had to act, and he had to act fast. Slowly, trickle by trickle, his heart was filling with an ugly and soul-chilling paranoia. He raised his eyes, sherry non going to sleep, and he looked at the red in Serizawa's eyes, a softer hue that made him look compassionate and kind. He had joined the forces to avenge the untimely death of his younger brother in the past. He could not avenge him, so, now, he spent his days in the military to keep his mind off the tragedy, one game to forget another. Convenient. Itaki inhaled the air and raised his eyes. The rain was less ferocious now, and a light was spreading along the horizon's vivid arc. It would be evening soon. He had to go back and end this game, it was the only way. He slipped a hand into the pocket of his pants and took out a scroll. Take this to the Shitchi leader in the mountains, he spoke and watched Serizawa tuck the box clumsily under his arm. He was a rather peculiar fellow. Serizawa pulled in a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. What about the scroll? Serizawa asked and took the scroll from his hand. A nauseous expression suddenly came to his face. The rain had left the rotting bodies soggy and wet. All that damp and rot made the air almost unbreathable. Even the wind was too weak now to push it away. Karen, Itaka spoke, and she came running from the forest's edge, her long red hair swaying back and forth across her buttocks. Take out the scroll we need and seal the rest. She nodded and took the box from Serizawa's hand. Serizawa looked confused. He scrunched his eyebrows together and tapped his finger to his forehead as though he was in deep thought. You said that we'd leave in the morning, Itaka-sama. I don't. He stopped, still appearing as lost as ever. It was a trait he had never grown out of ever since he stepped foot into the Genin Academy. It gave him an air of innocence and charms that earned him a doting wife a couple of years back. Itaka never could understand his mannerisms. You ask so many questions, Serizawa, he spoke, and ran his eyes over Serizawa's reddening cheeks. The man was easily embarrassed. Karen will be right at your heels in a few hours. It is a 2-day journey. Make haste. And with that, he left them alone amongst the dead and their dead silence. The night was a harlot that sang new songs, she was sweet and cunning, a vicious mistress of flesh. Everyone hid and played in their chambers, made a mess from the spills of their conjoinings. His eyes watched the ceilings, watery and hazy behind the twisting wreaths of incense. He let it sleep this time, it was not needed, the companion of his horrors. He felt her plump lips and the bite from her teeth on his throat, and the air throbbed about him like the throbbing slit between her thighs. Her smell went up his nostrils, and he knew that she was damp and eager to be filled for another union, and then she slid down to play with his genitals, to cast away the skin from a deadly shroud upon her flesh and strike him when he would not suspect. Silly. Itaka grabbed her smooth black hair, wound them round his hand with a quick spinning movement, and pulled her back. Kikyo let out a little yelp of surprise but quickly hid her anger with a bold expression. She bent her head down, her lips hovering over his. She wanted to plant a kiss there. You don't like to be kissed, Itaka-sama? She asked, and her warm breath fell over his lips like rancid vapors of poison. The light from the lantern on the right cast her left side in evil shadows. The shade of berries was still there, red on her pretty lips, a color she would remember till her final breaths. The tea she had given him made him a little dizzy. She was still up to no good. He wanted to curl to his left side, ride it out. His body, now, was a temple for pain, all sick, shivering, sweat-ridden. Silence was past's ghost and future's specter. It hovered by his side, always, and he had taken it into himself feverishly the way a woman in heat does a man. It was a pleasure of another kind. And her girl-like tricks were apparent on her face now, treachery of murder in her eyes and betrayal of blood on her lips. Her whole body was a grave for primal sins. All men paid the price, she would pay it sooner than most. He could not say the thought made him pity her. No, she bored him to no end now. "You still refuse me?" she asked, whispering close to his ear and rubbing her fingers harshly against his throat as though she wanted to choke him. Itaka did not speak, relishing the coming moments, head spinning in anticipation, thrill of the act. Games were tender. No man ever grew weary of them. A stack of tricks was the soul, and the art lay in transferring the blame elsewhere. He, too, was an unrepentant sinner, a betrayer of blood. Red was on his spirit, and it vibrated in fear at the visitations from truth and secret. Fear often read into his actions, but it was a matter of another time, another place. A bird's song rose, and her lips moved closer to his throat to kiss and sigh. "Why, Itaka-sama?" she asked again and pressed her bosom against his. "I shall give you more wealth and an incomparable pleasure you can only dream of. Why do you deny me? I'll become your strength, another sword in your hand. Give me a chance. Don't leave. I don't want to part from you so soon." Kikyo's words died against the blackbird's song. Its tongue was pure, powerful, honest. He gazed at the ceiling, sensing his blood fight off the poison in his system. His limbs felt the foreign substance's weight that mirrored itself in the form of sweat on his brow. The shadows on the ceiling were playing little children turning in a new motion to conquer another one. Little ruffians. Slit that throat. Make it bleed. Watch the little harlot weep. A sound of children's laughter rose from within that song, shaking his skin and bones. Oh, so pretty, one more murder of innocence was. He knew what was coming, a dagger's shining tip arched towards his throat, and he clasped hold of her trembling hands. She curled her fingers firmly around the hand that held the dagger and pushed it down. Chakra was in her hands, and his weakness was preventing him from throwing her off him. She was strong, too strong. Her hands began to shake, and her face warped in ugliness that he was not an easy prey for her to eat. Then the dagger pushed down more and more, and he managed to change the strike's angle. Now, it was aimed at his right eye. The whole room had disappeared behind the dagger's silver and her face and mouth's hue, a flowing rose. Uncontrollably, her hands trembled, and she grunted and pushed more chakra into her arms that the tip came down to brush against the fringe of his lashes. They did not flutter. Itaka's Sharinon had yet to be roused, a silent watcher of her last moments, and soon, it would wear upon itself a joyous mockery. His expression was still the same, unkind and uncaring. It did not seem that the situation perturbed him in any manner. There was no hint of nervousness in the baleful blacks, and it made her very afraid. Kikyo clenched her teeth and applied all the force she could muster into her hands, but to her surprise, her hands were being pushed up. Sweat was pouring down from her nose's tip to fall on his lips, disappearing into his pores, and, as if his lips were a dried-up bough that had quenched its thirst, she saw them tremble to shame her with a smile's mirage, one she loathed. She did not get a chance to make another strike as his hand shot forward and grabbed her by the throat. A death grip, and her flailing hands dropped the dagger to go for his hand. It was choking the life out of her. Kikyo clawed at his fingers, eyes bulging out, face going white as the powder, with which she loved to decorate her face. He did not relent, and his hand did not falter as he threw her back, and she went flying across the room, her head hitting the beam on the ceiling in the process. She crashed down and coughed violently to catch her breath, her hands kneading the throat that burnt. It needed water to cool down the hurting. She watched in horror as the lantern by his side dimmed. It felt the wickedness emanating from his body, and then, as if a puppeteer pulled at the strings of a puppet that lay flat on the floor, his limbs vibrated subtly. Each invisible string pulled at his joints to lift him up, starting from his feet and going all the way up to his head, and he stood up in one swift motion without touching the futon beneath him like a flexible bow, bent to its limit, released abruptly to stand robust again in the same stance. His head fell forward, and he just stood there, mechanically, like a toy, for a moment that was no longer than a single draw of breath. Her eyes widened, and she slithered back, a scared animal pressed to the ground, breathing hard as her eyes fell on the red overflowing into his eyes, and she knew she had to run. Her clammy feet barely moved, yet she gave them the strength she needed to flee. Kikyo spun away and ran to the door, moonlight blinding her for a moment as she pushed forward to open it, and crashed to the frost-chilled floor through the gap. Her legs hurt, but she ran to the hall when she heard his feet pursue her. This was not how she had imagined it. It was not right. And she ran, blood going cold in her veins with a terror she had never known before, her black as night hair, indistinguishable from night's shroud. They clung to her sweaty skin in curls and decorated the blush that invaded her cheeks from exertion. The shadows danced by her sides, and the sounds from his sandals behind her back were the most cruel ones she had ever heard. Where were her accursed men? She had sent them out to fetch Meru and hide the scroll. What a fool she had been. He played her and now he was going to take her life. Her feet felt too small to carry her enormous weight. Death and fear weighed heavily upon her soul, for it knew it had to be liberated in the coming moments. Accursed bitch, she would not let it. So she heaved another breath and ran deeper into the black corner in the temple hall. It would prove itself to be her sanctuary or grave. She hid behind the rain-washed pillar, light lifting off her face. She heard nothing but the watery sounds from the stream outside. His steps had gone silent. Had he left her alone? No, it could not have been that easy. The pillars around her were tall and thick, carrying their own shadows behind themselves. Suddenly, it was so quiet, and her breaths rattled through the sickly quietness like the whole place was a deathly trap to kill her here. She would wash him off her skin, if that was the last thing she would ever do. Kikyo knew a little sensing, and when she put it to good use, she felt a stilly, powerful chakra gather as a bubbling, congealing blood that came up from an old wound. Black veins traveled through the ceiling's stones and cement to the pillar by the door, throbbing grotesquely as though she was in the belly of the beast, staring at its pulsating innards. They joined together in the middle, and a wound appeared in the ceiling and oozed blood, akin to the delicate layer that had been ripped through with the motion of a thrill-seeking organ. It bubbled, a black goo, and dripped down. Something appeared in the black mass, a beautiful face, too pristine to be created by human hands, whose body was being created from the hellish mass of void that sat atop the apparatus, cradled in its slow-forming wings. White. And red eyes and that long white throat. All of that melted and dripped down to the floor, and she watched in utmost horror as tiny crows formed in the misshapen lumps that clung to the slippery side of the floor like the slime from a beast. It had erupted there after rutting, pleasured itself to contentment, and now it came for her throat. The little crows rose, their hungry caws vibrating in the halls, striking the pillars with a force that she felt like retching. The sound. It stirred her insides in ways he had stirred hers with his organ, but it was fear that had gushed forth from the crown and cloven to her womb's walls, and she knew she was about to birth the final remnants of her lust on the floor there. How disgusting! And it blent, the unholy mixture of crows, bones, black sludge, and he rose out of it all, beautiful and divine as though he had never been kissed by the vulgar and ugly side of evil. Life's colors spread under his flesh, and he looked like a devil's creature with beauty's skin. He turned his head and looked around, amused by the chakra vapors dispersed in the air. You have spread chakra here? It would do you no good. I do not need Sherinon to see you, Kikyo, Itaka spoke, his face coming into the moonlight's thick shaft, spilling inwards through the large door. Kikyo's heart trembled as his voice slid itself across her skin, hurting her spirit into a deadly submission. A shadow peered at him from behind the pillar, and he looked at it, smiling. A child's trick, he spoke, and she fired off 2 poison arrows from the crossbow. He threw 2 kunais, with a lazy flick of his wrist, and the shadow disappeared. His hand shot out and grabbed both arrows released at him with ease. There were strings attached to the arrows to deliver a right-hand charge and paralyze the enemy. She only got off a bit of her chakra when he yanked at the strings and she flew to him, her belly colliding with his fist. The crossbow fell from her shaking hands and clattered to the floor. Her last breath got knocked out of her, and she saw her own reflection looking up at her from the floor as it got obscured by the spit and water she deposited helplessly on it. He pulled his hand back and Kikyo lost her footing. She slipped and fell back to the floor, her eyes staring up to see him snap the arrows in 2. Itaka's shadow stood tall over her body weighed down by its presence. Moon shone brightly behind his back, an escape that was far away for her to reach. Passion leads to ugly things, he suddenly spoke, and his voice was loud and fierce in the empty temple's hall. The Buddha statues that stood mighty and big in the shadows gazed at her silent and still. They were watchers, spectators of her doom. She would be judged here ruthlessly before her trip to Yomi. How cruel this fate felt for someone so young, and she felt her eyes sting, shameless tears pouring down her cheeks. He was not moved. There was no change in his demeanor. He was watching her with an air of authority and a detachment. It was a game, and he had won. "Why do you weep, Kikyo?" he asked, almost sweetly, and his voice broke the stillness in the hall and she grimaced in anger. She craned her face up to him, blood smearing her lips. Raising her trembling fingers, she touched the foreign, hot wetness there, pulling away a thick string of spit and blood from her lips. Vomit came up to her throat, and she coughed out more red on her kimono and the floor, her eyes staring horrified as blood spilled from her lips and fell down by her trembling hands. Kikyo panicked, breaths turning ragged, and she clawed helplessly at her bosom as if she was dying. A pain exploded in her head and blood came from her eyes and nostrils in a string of droplets. She covered her face with her hands and looked at the red as they came away. Then she slapped them back against her cheeks twice and let out a loud, blood-shaking scream that pierced the hall deeply and shattered the silence. The Buddha behind her back was still quiet. And she screamed, kept screaming, crying hoarsely as she felt something grab hold of her soul and rip bits of it from her pretty little body. The hungry crow had pecked her to his full. Her feet slipped on the blood and spit she had vomited on the floor, and she pressed her back firmly against the statue's legs, hoping for it to swallow her whole. She could see the red in his eyes from between her trembling fingers, but she had no air left in her bosom to scream anymore. "What have you done?" she asked between hiccups whilst blood and makeup soot went down from her eyes in a thick and slow mixture. Itaka considered her for a moment, Sherinon stabbing at her spirit's fabric, tearing it apart the way he had done with the delicate film between her legs. "It is not poison," he spoke, and she took in a little breath of relief, "but you are a fool. Did you think this would work? Your uncle's men have been warned of the coming raid. They will not come to ambush Cloud's men and destroy the treaty." She gritted her teeth, breath hissing through her clenched jaws. "You be bastard. You won't get your hands on the scroll. Meru will kill you and your brother if something happens to me. You'll get nothing." She shouted and clenched her bloody trembling fingers into fists. "Meru is dead. I killed him myself a day ago," he spoke, and the loud, whistling sounds of her breaths vanished under silence's crushing descent. "The missives you received were from me. You confessed to me that you loved them." Then a faceless form drifted like dust towards her and shook her mortal cage. Her face shuddered and more tears wiped away the blood from her cheeks. "What do you want? Leave me be, you wicked man, leave me be," she said roughly, trying her hardest to hide the fear. Itaka took out the scroll from his pocket and showed it to her, and a careless cry tore from her throat. "You were playing a dangerous game," he spoke and pushed the scroll back into his pocket. "I would have left you alone had you not gone after the treaty." And that heart throbbed in her bosom as she moved her feet again to move away from him as he walked to her. She locked her jaws to prevent a scream. He had reduced her to a sniveling little girl. He sat down on one knee and brushed a thumb across her shaking lips. "Sometimes, it is wise to let go. Why did you not let things go, Kikyo? Look, how you have ruined the shade of berries on your lips," he whispered and wiped clean his thumb against her kimono's white fabric and left a red smear there as a last reminder for her eyes. "Your death is inevitable. You will die in 2 days' time, bleeding from your mouth, eyes, and nose. No. Don't do this. Please, I beg of you." She pleaded shakily, moving her head from side to side, crying fresh tears of great fear and greater sorrow. It was not true. It was just not true. It could not be true. Ice-cold sweat poured out from her body, and her heart forgot to beat at that revelation. She was going to die. And then her heart beat so loudly in defiance that she could hear nothing but its flesh-shaking beats inside the frail chamber her spirit occupied. "I cannot do anything for you now," Itaka spoke, his voice still very delicate as he looked at her the way he always did, a touch of playfulness in his passion-trapped eyes that mocked her with renewed malice now. "You should have stayed put when I warned you, but you did not listen. You wanted to be bold. There is nothing more to be done. I could only delay its assault on your senses one last time. That is the only reason I stayed. He smiled and removed the pin from her hair and they tumbled down to her shoulder. Itaka looked at the pin, as though it amused him, and pushed it into the fabric of her kimono's collar. Her mind was spinning wildly. Thoughts were going away, and she was trying to piece everything together to save her sanity, but everything flew away as dust. He stood up and started walking away from her, and she, in sheer desperation, cast aside a mortal's pride, moved, and fell forwards, her hands scrambling on the floor to hold on to something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned a little to look at her face pressed against the crude layer of blood and spit and slime on the floor. I must confess, the heave of your bosom and sounds of your breaths were delightful. He spoke in the softest voice she had ever heard from his lips, and then he smiled most beautifully and walked out of there in silence, leaving her screams and fractured memories behind the walls. She forgot it all too soon. Again everything was reconstructed into the lies he fed her. He made it to the forest's edge, a night's journey. Serizawa was waiting for him there with Karen. 3 days were wasted in her games. The rains were heavy, and the passages, deluged with water. They decided to take the long way around. His crow flew down to him on the 5th day with a missive. Kyo had killed her with the night flower poison from the harlots. The poor thing had bled to death at the foot of the temple stairs, a crime of passion. They put him to death there and then. Her brother was aggrieved, though the matter was not any of his concern. The Uchiha village was silent at this hour. Lanterns hung bright outside the doors, and trees whispered in strange tongues into his ears. It was the coming season's new song. He retraced his steps back to his home. It was silent. He did not need Sherinon to look inside his own house. He stepped into the manor. Tanaka had left the door open. He had sent a letter to Kai from the last outpost that he was coming. It was late and he was tired. Itaki had just removed the sword from his back when the main door opened. It was Kai and he was breathing heavily. He looked at Itaki in anxiousness. He wanted to speak but Itaka forestalled him in a grave voice. You think you can come barging into someone's house whenever it pleases you? Have you no shame? Kai went down on his knees and bowed deeply. Itaki-sama, please, forgive me. He stopped and breathed in several quick breaths whilst he tried to calm his breathing. I tried to stop them, I truly did, but they didn't listen to me. Color flew from Itaka's lips and cheeks and worry started to crowd his face. His Sherinon shuddered, a maiden's red-dyed cloth, in his eyes to see and to look. There was nothing in the house, empty. His lips trembled for a moment, and he gathered his stray wits to speak in a voice that was curiously low. Where is Suzuki? Kai breathed deeply once and got to his feet. He looked defeated, sorrowful, remorseful. Rude shinobis came and arrested him, he said, and watched Itaka turn his face away into the shadows that assailed light. I tried to stop them, but they had warrants for his arrest. I couldn't do anything. When did this happen? Itaki asked again in a voice that was the same as before, and the black lips of his shadow moved behind his back, as it plastered itself like a parasite to the wall. 5 days ago, he whispered, and Itaka turned his angry face to him. He was livid, red, clamorous against the night. He stepped towards Kai, his face dark as it bore the weights of all the shadows about him. I asked of you to watch him, a mere boy, yet you could not even manage that, he hissed, and Kai flinched in fear. They must have dismantled his mind by now to amuse themselves. Why did you not tell me? You could have sent one accursed missive to warn me. Why did you not do this? Kai lowered his head, staring at his sandals, his weak heartbeats picking up the pace. Tsunade-sama told me not to. My hands were tied, he said, sounding quite afraid, his Sherinon refusing to rise up to bear the brunt of Itaka's wrath. She speaks of many things, Itaka spoke, and Kai felt him draw closer, though he had no strength in his legs to move away from his towering shadow, yet you had done just that despite her protests. Did you do this on purpose? Kai jerked his head up, his eyes widening to meet Itaka's. The red there was steeped in a vile kind of anger. And no, Itaka-sama. I'd never do that, I swear. She warned me that Root might interfere with your mission. She said that she had it all under control. I thought it was for the best. For the best that you left him to rot in prison, counting down the days till they put him to death? That must have been amusing for you, he spoke, and Kai saw the corner of his mouth twitch in anger. Kai chose silence. It was hopeless. He would not win against him. He watched Ataka grab his sword and move towards the door. As he passed by Kai, he stopped and spoke again, and this time, Kai could hear a clear note of threat in his voice. For the good of all? For your sake, I hope you are truthful. Then he swiftly walked out through the front door and left Kai standing there to stare at the Uchiha symbol that glowed under the lantern. Chapter 58, Brother Against Brother. The house's growing dusk that sailed behind the smothering grey shone into his eyes, and he saw his shadow drape itself over a model of pink and red, there sure signs of youth. Eyes unsure stared back at him and lost the vigor slowly. A young knight sang colors into his eyes and looked for darkness in his ears. Purple wings scorching, searching in the purple light, nature's fingers had stippled their wings, fluttering black eyes stared back at him, shadows dancing on the walls that closed in on him, revenge-soaked men advancing from battle. He did not know what it was, but, as the blade moved across the throat, love went out in silence. A scream came from him as his body gave a shudder and denial deluged over him. His friend had not died alone in the water's depths this time. Red bled out in his eyes, and his body sang in pain, of which he had never known in his short life. The scene before him was dismal, bleak. A slow black spread towards his sandals, and a strong life scent floated to him from the quiet, disturbed by the groans from wood beneath the body that convulsed under an unseen burden. Rain came down, and the wood's pleas were muffled by its hands. Storm, it wished to speak, drown out his loud woes and stares. Its flashes glared at his tears, and he stared deep, oh, so deep, touching the unseen that rippled there against a vacant tune. Its ripples traveled into his skin, and his flesh was alight with its symphony. Red, red, red darkening in the friend's throat and dimming in his eyes. A tune was played, and his heart sensed trepidations travel to and fro, rattle the soul that sang out an unsung song. It shrieked and wounds tore open in his eyes, and they, too, had sung, they, too, had felt that sweetness of longing, passion, and perhaps, death. Then they bled deep and they bled cold, and there was no relief for his soul. He went down as the dark came over him, and wings cast the shadow on his back. His cheek met the red-smeared wood, putting a blush there, yet it hid it, too. He was a shy one still, but it would change. It always did. And the red pinwheel spun in the wind, and the sight turned his eyes pinwheels into sharp instruments his hands would never wield. They cut through his eyes, little knives that metamorphosed into worms, and wriggled out. Reserved martyrs his eyes bled, yet they remained affixed on the spectacle before them. What a delightful dance in protest, but his friend's spirit had not given up the hope to stay united with his flesh in obscene conjoining. There was no greater intimacy to be had. The thing came to him, silent and bold. He felt its fingers spread across his flesh, eyes still staring deep. They did not want to leave that place, that dark, dark place in his friend's eyes. They had seen and they had felt and they had sung, but now they had to pay the price. Little hairs stood up, alert, and goose flesh formed on his body. He had been so tempted to taste it, too. Just a little sip. And the pain was immense. Infinite. Little hooks went deep into his bones and flesh, and he was strung up, a fish. They pried him open, breaking the seams, cleaving the tendrils, and he was cut open in ways that he had never thought possible. The faceless tormentor yanked at his spirit to let him go, but it could not. It was not the spirit's time to leave the chamber it loved to fill to the deepest depths his own thoughts had never plumbed. His flesh opened here, there, everywhere, like a flower, a purple lily, bloody petals opening their mouths to the light of salvation, stab of absolution. It was not his time to go. Still, his stare did not waver whilst he looked at the shuddering, protesting spirit get dragged out from his friend's body. Blood spread copiously on the floor and flowed into the crevices and congealed there in the cold. A smell of earth fought a relentless war against the smell, but it could not fend off its advance. Its sword was potent and its shield was cruel. The smell could not leave this chamber alone. Light and shadow danced and sang in the rain, but his pain was without end. His flesh was torn apart, limb from limb, yet there was not a cut on his white flesh that still possessed the suppleness of boyhood. His friend's spirit was leaving, and his was being torn unwillingly from his body. The hooks pulled and yanked and drew it out of him. The little trickster had to take its leave, too. A fool, it had whispered and called upon the great liberator. His jaws opened wide as screams filled his throat like rancid vomit. A wanton hand went deep into his throat and grabbed hold of his wet, sickly flesh, his very soul. The fingers curled around its quaking form and dragged it out, and his body thrashed, his convulsions intensified, and he foamed at mouth, spewing blood, but the hand went in deeper, as though groping for bits of his spirit hiding in the crevices between bone and flesh. Terror-tuned, his eyes rolled around in his sockets, and the world was dark as blood in the night. The retching sounds did not stop, and the hand went deeper still till it touched something in him. And his whole body went cold like a lonely grave. Everything stopped. The rain had gone silent. He had gone silent. A dark menace whispered into his ear sweetly, and his sight returned. Then it was pulled out of him, a velvet red, and it flowed from his mouth, coloring his lips and teeth in a decadent color. Red went out from his mouth like frightened snakes and slithered away from the lantern's light that was growing duller, sinister things that fled from light, and he was remade in death, eyes staring at the wings, treble instruments of his fate. Something thick struck the stones outside, and the moth flew away, and his eyes opened. The man before him stopped mid-motion, trembling at the shurikens spinning with an evil tune in his eyes, a silence he had felt and heard for the first time in the longest time. The man muttered an indistinct apology and averted his eyes and bent down to pick up the heavy padlock. His brow strained, legs shook a bit, and then he turned to pull open the heavy door. The nails grated against rust, and a stale, rot-laden air rushed out from the darkness undulating on the stairs. They had put out most of the lanterns. A bone-cold light lay on the wall, covered in a layer of dank neglect, and the black floor at the foot of the chiseled stairs. The guard stepped back, shrinking away from his tall shadow. Its blackness was a vivid mirage, carriage of wickedness. Tonight, the flower's glimmer was lost and lay tucked away behind the fortress made from neglect and shame and dishonor. He had to pluck it out of the ground again, plant it deep into his heart's forest in its gloom, watch it grow, and feel the ripples of joy change its unfriendly disposition. The guard walked a safe distance in his wake, taking timid and cautious steps as though he feared his ire. His shadow flickered and swayed away from him, almost folding into itself as they walked into the long and narrow corridor. There was nothing here but broken pipes and briny water's musty smell and cheap alcohol-soaked air caressed by night's hand. Yet his shadow was sure as it slithered across the walls and twisted along the uneven stones as snakes whilst he walked. This time, there were no leaves to crunch and no lilies to distract his gaze. The lush field was a cell and the ground was a cold stone floor. Nothing grew here but traces of fungi. It had fed upon the musk and sweat in the air to grow in the forgotten fissures. A terrible odor rose into the air as he drew near the cluster of fading lilies. The air turned humid and sick, the lilies vanished, and the night was darker now, a disappearing memory from a long-forgotten winter. The scent of them wriggled like a restless worm in his nose, and then it was gone, a tricky spectre, and left behind an airy image of a child lying still amongst their flickering colors for his changing eyes. The veil lifted, slowly, beautifully, as he moved through the illusion, dancing on quiet steps, and he beheld the child. His young flesh had filled up the mold of nature's change, and a young man sat on the floor in the memory's place, hardened by time, softened by boyhood, surrounded by the wilting flowers of Itaka's past. Moths had come and moths had fled, but one fluttered close, lingering there, and red shivered and emanated from his eyes that, too, wore their own faces set in a face that related a rigid control that never faltered. Something moved back, a languid motion of darkness able hand, dispersed before his eyes, and they became accustomed to the nature of his surroundings. It was quite dirty in here. Filthy. Something slick and slimy was stuck to the side of the charcoal-colored wall. He could not tell what it was as it wriggled there, shining in the light, going into the cracks for refuge as though his heavy shadow had invaded its quiet sanctuary. Maggots. Walls were grimmed and candied with dirt and soaked through with autumn rains from the window. The floor was smeared in mud and dust that encrusted the little bumps, embedded in the gaps between the stones. Something festered between the layers, alive and wriggling, breeding unchecked. It was so quiet that the sounds of his breaths were enough to invade and lay waste to the silence. The light from this moon was shy. It had laid down its weapons before the battle even began. Pale beams struck his back, distorted, spilt over his form's contours and, like hammers in the blacksmith's trusted hands, beat down the shadows of several bars on the young man's body, but he was unmoved as though he had borne and worn them for ages, made a pact with fate with a brave-hearted resignation. A frown crossed Itaka's brow, throbbing there for a moment, out of place, and a look of utmost displeasure came into his face. Then it vanished, and his eyes settled on the youth who was but a boy-child, just sitting there, legs folded underneath his thighs, back stooped like that of an old man's, and head bowed. A collar was put around his neck, and a stout chain at the back was made fast to a big hook pegged deep into the wall. His hands were tied behind his back. They had removed his flak jacket, but he was still wearing his office uniform. He was barefooted, a little white in the unforgiving dust of light. He was breathing slowly, and a little deeply, turning his face away from the light as he felt it tingle on his white skin, dirted by sickness and rot that permeated the air like an invading pestilence. He could not have seen it as an ornamented funjutsu seal cloth of a dimity sort was wound round his eyes and tied at the back in a knot. It was meant to seal the sight and ears. Itaka doubted that the boy could feel much, but his shivering skin was an evidence of his working senses. The vibrations in the air had become his eyes and ears. Itaka took a single step forward and watched the youth's face turn angry, almost resentful. A breath shuddered out of him, and he clenched his jaws for a moment before his face faded into the same soft look of resignation. Bits of dust sparkled in the light, a mockery of a man-created morn. Itaka did not like it at all. A feeling of freezing anger rushed through Itaka's body. It was a tidal wave of change, mirrored by his eyes. Anger singed their surface, and they turned, bleeding there to show what his face could not. His shadow moved, still haunting an inch away from the child's shadow, as though saving it from its sinister mantle. Itaka turned slightly and half his face was cast in light. The guard flinched again at the sight of his mien, clutching the padlock tightly as though it might slip and explode right at his feet if he dropped it again. "Why did you bring him here?" Itaka asked, eyes dangerous and bold. "Itaka-sama, I was told that the prisoner will be kept here till his—" He stopped and dragged in that terrible air that made him cough, "execution." He lowered his head and eyes almost immediately and felt a rigid intensity come from Itaka's eyes and strike his spirit into submission. A chill vibrated in his bones, and he clutched the padlock harder as though he had it in his mind to cast it at Itaka's face as a last resort to save his neck. "Open it," Itaka commanded, voice thick, and trained the eyes light on the man's sweaty face. He was staring at Itaka, appearing quite dumbfounded, and not staring at him, too, but looking at something there in Itaka's eyes, something faceless and inwrought with a feeling that was nameless as the sensation that had been nagging him ever since Itaka stepped foot into the prison about an hour ago. But I was. Are you denying my command?" Itaka asked, and it sounded less like a question and more like another command, with a faint note of threat that was punctuated that much more by his humorless smile. He flinched again, as if out of a new habit he had developed in the presence of a man he had never seen up close till tonight, and moved, hand going into his pocket to pull out a thick set of keys. The keys jangled as his hand fumbled to grab the right one. He lifted his head thrice and cracked a nervous grin, assuring Itaka that he was not doing this to make a fool out of him. He truly did not know which key was needed. The damned guard before him had left in a hurry after pressing these keys into his hand. He would flog that fool's nates to glaring springs tomorrow. He silently sent a swear to his father's grave. At last, he found the right one, rammed it into the keyhole, twisted it, and saw the seals burn and fade from the door. The young man in the cell stirred as he felt the vibrations and cold move up against his skin. Then he relaxed again, and his face went calm and suggested little of the misery and humiliation he had faced in this cell. Itaka stepped into the cell, and his eyes fell upon the glass of water that lay untouched close to the boy's knee. The loaf of bread in the plate under the shadow of his breast had gone soggy and rotten. He had not touched it. The red was in slumber now, and Itaka watched, without that anchor, the cracks in his little one's lips. Thirst and hunger had been his sure companions in this lonely cell. There was a moment's pause before Itaka moved his own hands and made the seals to cancel out the funjutsu bindings on Suzuki. A slow tremble flowed in a wave through Suzuki from the surroundings, sensations, sounds, feelings. He suddenly looked a bit wary. Still a child, young enough to not hide the feelings that attacked his heart with all their might now. Itaka saw sweat form on the visible parts of Suzuki's skin, quivering there in the cold. One of the large veins in his neck was throbbing erratically in anticipation of something dreadful and cruel. Itaka gestured the man to remove his bindings. The man did not flinch this time, having developed a sense of habitual ease to deal with him now, and tripped to Sasuke with clumsy steps. His hands faltered and the chain shook, clanked loudly in the gloom. Slowly, and with as much care he could exhibit, he removed the collar, unclasped it from behind, undid the binds on Sasuke's hands, and untied the knot at the back of his head. Then he pulled away the cloth as it slipped down over Sasuke's cheeks. He backed away and sighed. It was done. Sasuke brought his arms forward and blinked once, twice, thrice. His eyes tried hard to get used to the ugly light coming in from the corridor. His pupils shrank and dilated as he focused his attention on the feet that invaded his vision. A chilly air came to him, an oppressive sound, and then it was a shadow that brushed a bit against his own, sending a current of realization skittering through his veins faster than blood. He craned his neck and raised his gaze to look upon his older brother's countenance, frigid, a thing crafted from marble. Itachi saw the dark red that rimmed Sasuke's eyes. Pallor was perceptible in his face under the untidy hair that had lost its luster with dirt and neglect, and there was no surprise in the boy's gaze, just bits of innocent anger and a superficial sort of cool that hid his feelings almost. He could not conceal the formation of a little crease in his brow. Itachi walked away from him, dragged his shadow away from the boy's body, and stopped by the door in the cell. "Come," Itachi spoke without emotion as he stood there motionless and still before the light to, almost deliberately, cast his shadow on the wall behind him, and then he walked away. Sasuke breathed in twice, deep and slow, and raised himself to his feet. His joints ached and his limbs, stiff as iron, throbbed in retaliation. He had not moved from this place through 5 days and nights. The new light felt strong in his eyes and on his skin. He squinted against it and walked out from the cell, struggling to keep his back straight. His legs threatened to fold beneath him, but he was too stubborn to let his body win. He climbed the stairs, leaving behind a pursuing hand of dark in its hooked teeth, feeling a sense of freedom and elation swell in his heart against his will. When the night wind hit him, it filled his body with an invigorating sensation he sorely missed in that cell. A smile lost its way before it could reach his lips as his eyes peered at the darkness rising up to create walls about him. His brother had not stopped, and he was moving with a poised gait and dignified bearing to their house, a place that had become more and more dreadful with each passing winter. Sasuke looked back and saw an opening in the ground vanish in the yellow grass. A little rancid smell of that place floated out, but it was trapped behind the barrier's formation. Funjutsu seals. The corner of his lips pulled down into a frown, and his eyes narrowed. He looked ahead, searching for his brother in the darkness below the menacing sky that growled with impatience in a hollow belly. Itachi had not stopped. And there was no use calling out to him, so Sasuke did the same after sparing the underground prison one last sour glance. The forest around them was singing as it stood shapeless in the night. He did not know where they were, not till he came across the lake that was now but a shapeless mass with waves chasing one after another on its surface. Lights blinked in the distance behind the twisted branches. They were outside leaf. They walked along the edge of a dry path, and he trailed behind his brother, eyes on his back, through the haze of a distorted mist. The walk back home was a quiet one. There was a perceivable distance between them, long enough for the older shadow to not disturb the younger one's domain. Wind went whispering into Sasuke's ears, and its muffled sounds intensified, hissing out wordless misgivings. A storm was approaching. He could tell. Usually, Itachi always called Sasuke to his chamber whenever he came back home from long journeys. It had become a habit. Itachi would ask how he was, what he did, and other little things. It had been this way as long as he could remember, but tonight it was different. Tonight that routine had broken and his brother's silence was louder than the wailings from Wind's toothless mouths. It had become hungry babes, eyeless in search of her breasts that, in search of something more, awaited the belly above their heads to split open, spill out its innards, and feed the little beasts. Sasuke stopped for a moment to catch his breath. His bones hurt, and a chill had gone deep into his flesh. A hot current coursed in his veins alongside the blood. He was coming down with another terrible fever. He gulped down the cold air, as if it was water, and looked through the swirling deep gray that mingled with the darkness. Golden leaves, crackling and fragile, flurried in the wind that stung his eyes. Itachi still had not stopped. And anger whipped him good this time. His brother had ruined it, he had ruined it all. A blush crawled to the crest of his cheekbones. It was so cold here that his body, now, was battling feverishly against its assaults with a weapon of anger in one hand and a shield of rebellion in the other. He would not go down easy. The demonism of his brother's wicked ways was clear to him now, very clear. The darkness stood at the door of his sanity, and he would open it this time and wage a war against him. Suzuki's anger morphed into determination, and he pulled in a deep breath to walk into the opening mouths of darkness. Wind was blowing strong when they crossed the garden of their manor. Kai had been standing outside all this time, shivering. Soft rain was splashing into his eyes, and he widened his eyes and said something Itaka did not bother to heed. He kept walking, as though in chase of a helpless prey that would drop dead soon, and made his way to the dimmed room that was no more than a prison for the younger one. Suzuki let out an uneven white breath, stopped for a moment to cast Kai a look of utmost disgust, followed his brother down the wooden stairs that led away from the main house. The sounds of rain tinkled here, subdued. Yu stood with his back to the lantern he had lighted just now. His shadow flickered for a moment and steadied with the flame. He turned around at the sound of Itaka's controlled steps sloshing through a layer of water on the wood. His face grew white and surprised. He opened his mouth at the sight of Suzuki's face, which was dust white against his coal-black hair streaked with rain and so much dirt. He looked miserable, ill, and a little angry. Suzuki-sama, you, he gasped and moved towards him, emotions overtaking his usually timid face. Are you all? Why is there water on the floor? Itaki asked, face whiter than his younger brother's in the light. The wind blew in this direction, Itaki-sama. I'll clean it up, he explained and clamped his one hand on Suzuki's shivering shoulder and held the other one above it to exude a green glow. He was trying to heal him. Leave him be, Itaka spoke as coldly as he could, and his face turned to them to appear black in the shadows, with red decorations in his eyes that burned bright. Open this. He gestured with a subtle tilt of his head towards the sturdy double door. You did not have to be told twice. He nodded and opened the thick latch on the door. Then he pushed it forward and felt a rush of warmth slide up against his skin. The fireplace was hot, and a kettle was whistling on the bronze brazier. There was food on the low table, too. The window was closed. He had done exactly as Itaki had asked of him. Itaka directed his gaze to Suzuki, eyes burning hotly. Suzuki looked at them once and felt a chill rush to his heart. He did not say anything and walked into the room and welcomed the engulfing warmth. He had not expected to live through the ordeal and the terrible cold in that cell. A part of him was happy to see Itaki. Suzuki slumped down against the wall, exhausted, his breathing calm now. He leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and breathed in the aroma from tea and food. The hunger was killing him now, but the drowsiness was stronger. He began to float in the air when the loud thud of the door woke him up. He sat up straight with a jerk, blinked, and bent forward, putting his face in his hands as though he was hiding it from Itaka's sherry non. I am surprised that you did not starve yourself to death before my return, Itaka spoke and watched Suzuki pull his hands away from his face. His eyes were bleary and weak. His sherry non had been defeated before his nature this time, but he did not meet Itaka's gaze. Silence. Thunder rumbled, impatient, and rain answered meekly. A storm was approaching, and it would be upon them in the coming moments. Why? He spoke again, a little pause there between the breaths, voice unfriendly like fingers of the dead. These games. Wind shrieked, struggled in through the gap under the door from behind Itaka, and his shadow drew near. It was no more, no less, colder than his wintry voice that was at odds with a hue that warmed his lips, probably the only thing on his face that made him look human. A red glow traveled along Suzuki's left cheek and neck as he turned his face away to look at the fire. He did not want to look upon the dreadful countenance of his brother. He knew he would find nothing but anger in his face and eyes now. The silence prolonged, finally broken by a particularly sharp whistle from the kettle's mouth. It was emitting a gush of steam. The shadows by his side danced like boisterous children that wore a prickly yellow glow on their heads. A perfumed steam still rose from the food, its aroma pleasant, but not with as much intensity as before. The food was going cold, and his hunger was diminishing, as well. He found solace in the company of dark by eluding the red. The fire was warm on his face. The sky growled again, its belly vacant, and the wind's answer was sweet, still a child's plea. What mess have you made for me this time? Itaka finally asked, his voice less sweet than the rains and winds. Suzuki could hear it so clearly in the murmurs from begotten mouths. His gaze was distracted by a rosy streak that traveled along the low table's edges. The red in his own vision needed the cadence to rise again to the surface. Suzuki did not have it in him to battle Itaka's red tonight, not now. Silent, always silent, Itaka spoke in one of his softer tones that his voice was made to sound almost gentle. When I want you to stay put, you never listen, and when I want you to speak, you choose silence. You have grown disobedient, hot-headed, wild. What should I do with you? Thunder struck the room, scraping the wooden walls, begging to be let in. It disturbed his brother's voice for a moment that was still resonating in the room, but the coldness that laced through it hung between them as though a menacing spirit. It moved, undulating, silent. I am speaking to you, you ill-mannered child, he spoke, and this time, his voice did not get caught up in the wind. It was piercing cold, colder than the ravenous mouths that begged before their mother to feed their hungry bellies. Suzuki shivered, pulled his knees close, and locked his arms around his knees like a child. Have it your way. I will find out in the coming moments, regardless of your silence, Itaka spoke and his voice was still the same, an angry intonation invading its smooth tone. Suzuki heard his steps move towards the door. Then he heard him stop to add, you create dreadful surprises for me, but this time, I will make sure that you experience my disappointment. A scraping and a thudding sound came to Suzuki, and he turned his face to the door. Itaka had closed it behind him. Now, he was alone in the company of dark and shadows. He heard indistinct voices speak beyond the door, but it was no use. Thunder was too loud. He returned his tired eyes to the comforting flames, and his face turned so angry. Kai had saved her on purpose, and the thought made him grit his teeth, his face warping, contorting in loathing, red rising like slips of fish to skim the black waters in his eyes. A wind with greater strength swept at him from the mountains. It carried the rot and cold from autumn. The ground was uncertain beneath his feet, shivering in fear from the coming lashes of an angrier thunder. The wind was shrill, no longer meek before its pleas. He raised his eyes and saw lights flicker in Tsunade's office. It was not a surprise, the guard had been quick to report to Danzo. Itaka made his way to the office with quick and stiff steps. Arguing voices from the door intruded on his ears, but he did not slow down, he did not have the luxury. When he pushed open the door, he saw silhouettes. He had put the red to sleep for now. They had gone silent at the sight of his countenance that betrayed the mildest presence of displeasure. He did not turn to close the door and gave it a slight push with his hand. The click of it was louder in the silence. Its sound was sucked in by the walls with a sudden temptation. Warm glow radiated from the lantern sitting on her table that was still cluttered with an untidy mess. And sake. It was a mild pink one tonight. You Danzo began in a voice that had the rough and jagged edges of old age, how dare you remove the prisoner without my consent? Itaka considered him for a moment, eyes tracing his real form out of the haziness of a going shadow. It is in my authority to handle the prisoners as I see fit, he spoke, voice firm, face a blank canvas below the brush of emotions. Danzo turned around and his body assumed a darker shade. Behind him, his shadow climbed up to engulf one part of the ceiling. He tapped his stick lightly on the floor the way blind men did. It seemed as though he had lost his way and found himself in a room he had no place in. Your brother has committed yet another remarkable act of treason. I would have sent you his head as a welcoming gift, but you have the Heim under your thumb, he spoke, a chill from age and anger running through his raspy voice. Hold your tongue, miserable old fool. Tsunade retorted, letting her hand fall from the large table. Her cheeks had an angry tint that glowed in the light. Light spread out, a gentle wave, towards them as she took a single step back to increase the distance between Danzo and herself. His old face was cast in light and shadow, but their trick was not enough to hide age's deep marks in his withered face. The grooves appeared deeper, more pronounced in the light. You're hasty to reach a conclusion, Danzo, Shikaku said, appearing tired. His deep-lined brow was frowning under the black hair. Sweat lined his brow, and his hair was wet with perspiration. He was usually a reserved fellow, but he appeared a little agitated tonight. Where are the rest of the council members? Itaki asked, and his eyes roved over the hazy faces and settled on the deep shadows under Danzo's eyes. There was a glint of wickedness in their deeps. He did not require the Sherry-non to see the unrest and uneasiness prodding at his heart. Danzo has called for a meeting tomorrow, Shikaku said and heaved a sigh. His frown deepened. He always likes to trick us with his games, Tsunade remarked and cast a glance at the temptation sitting on her table and allowed herself a little smile. Don't you, Danzo? Enough. Danzo retorted in a throaty hiss and struck his stick onto the floor with as much strength as his age could allow him as if to punctuate a point. The sound reverberated in the quiet. Thunder had chosen not to impede its path. His eyes traveled to the slim and tall figure that stood silent and dark in Shadow's vestments. Your brother, he spoke, voice trapped in his old throat's depth, ringing there as though a rusty clapper of a temple's bell. He has killed another one of my trusted men Toruin. And he was shivering in anger, teeth clenched, back straight like his stick. A beat thrummed from Itaka's heart, going deep, diminishing like a weak vibration. Then it collided against the ethereal substance that lay still and quiet in the deep recesses of his mortal frame, slumbering, and it stirred in answer, releasing a whirlwind of sounds and smells and colors that went through his bones and flesh and blood, coming back with force to crash into his heart again with a new song, a wild child, stay wild, filled with mistrust, beguiled. It was singing now in distress, fear, fury. The glaring old eye was bent on him, and for the first time in his life, Itaka felt a sinister chill unfurl its serpent coils in his heart. The little hairs on his nape reacted, and his blood turned a bit colder, and the thrumming became louder, but he had control, frightening control, and he did not let Danzo invade his calm any longer. They are dropping like spring gnats. He must be missed, Itaka spoke, a faint touch of amusement in his tone, watching as the shivering upper lip pulled back on pink gums with a ferocious sneer of contempt. How dare you? Danzo hissed this time and advanced towards Itaka, hoping to win a challenge, but his languid feet stopped short as though they had been clogged up with mud and rotten leaves of autumn at the sight of the threatening red emerging from the depths in Itaka's eyes. He tapped his stick on the floor twice and turned his face away to escape the tricks of Itaka's visions. Lightning cracked down on them and filled the room with a blinding brightness. It vanished and left cobwebs going in different directions in their visions, but the red had stayed it always did. If the boy was guilty, I would have seen his head on my doorstep, a free gift from your generous hands. A man like you would not have let this chance slip by, Itaka spoke, and this time, his eyes changed to spin as shurikens. Tsunade and Shikaku were quiet. Your tendency to shelter Konoha's traitor has disappointed me. How long will you protect him, shield his lies? Danzo asked and shifted on the spot to cast him a terrible gaze, and his face had suddenly burrowed itself under the sludge of shadows again. We shall see how you drag him out of this terrible crime. He has killed 2 of my men in cold blood and vengeance. I will not abide treachery. His last breath came out as a noisy sputter. He was shaking, his old frame vibrating in rage. For Sage's sake, Shikaku mumbled and wiped his forehead clean, his face wearing displeasure. They all watched as Danzo walked out of the office with robust steps, his stick clicking against the wooden floor. Tsunade grabbed the glass from the table and emptied it in a single breath. Light trickled over her face, and the blush shone with a deeper flush in her supple cheeks. Breaths hissed out from between her teeth, and she made a silly face after she passed her tongue over her lips to rediscover pleasure's sting. The sake was good. Send the letters to the council members, Tsunade said and let out a puff of warm air through her nostrils and nodded her head a few times. Make haste. She gestured to the door with a quick movement of her hand. Shikaku sighed but did not object. He left the room with quick steps. With the shadows gone, the lantern cast enough light now and limned the curves of her lovely face. Your brother, he's created another trouble, she said as she turned around to pour out another glass for herself. She was clumsy and sloshed a little sake on the scroll. It did not seem to bother her. Has he? Itaki asked, and there was a subtle hint of curiosity in his voice that she found to be mocking. Tsunade turned around fully, fingers tightening around the empty sake glass. Don't play games, boy, she hissed, ruddy cheeks growing redder still. They found the runt with his throat cut in the forest. The same wound, just as deep. He was bled dry. We couldn't even find a memory in his head. What did that wild boy tell you? She gulped and pressed the glass to her lips to take a whiff of that sharp smell. He has not said anything to me. That wild child. He is angry that I left him all alone in the cell to be punished, but why ask me when your mind is already made? Itaka spoke, and there was a tiny smile that crawled over his lips this time, like a lost moth. He looked a bit amused. Tsunade's face contorted, and she threw the glass to the wooden floor and broke it. Its shards spread out, glinting in the scant light. He lazily looked at the broken glass and then to her. There was no change in his expression. Don't mock me, she warned, voice hissing in anger's grip, lips red as ripe berries, shaking. I am not, he spoke, tone calm, serene, eyes fire struck like a dangerous mechanism, face sinister in a silhouette. If you had found something, you never would have asked me of it. I protected him. Had it not been for me, he'd. Have you? Itaka cut across her and took a single step towards her. She was in half a mind to move away from him, but she held her ground and raised her eyes and face to meet his eyes. Red had come out from them, and they bled unchecked with an eerie aura. It chilled her. You made me heartfelt promises, yet he was rotting away in that cell in my absence. All it took was one leave. You could not wait to tighten your grasp on him. Then he bent his head down, and she felt as though he was pouring that cold red sludge straight into her eyes. The same accusation? Haven't you grown tired of it? Tsunade asked and reached for another glass on the table to distract herself. They'd evidence against your wild brother, but Kai came through. The boy was with him and the chakra in his body was good and strong. It couldn't have been a Bunshin, but Danzo had evidence that he killed Torin in the forest, cut his throat in two. Ibiki confirmed it, but he couldn't have been at two places at once. That's not the only thing that saved your brother. I stopped Danzo from reading his mind on grounds of clan secrets. I couldn't have allowed it in your absence. You're the new clan head, after all. You should be thankful that I kept your secrets safe and the boy alive. Then she tapped her hand against her breast twice and clamped her lips together in a tight line and spoke no more. To Tsunade's surprise, he smiled and stared down at her thoughtfully. Butterflies appeared in reality's translucent fabric, changed into moths about him, and then they vanished. She looked about him, confused. He could only smile. Tricky child, Itaka spoke and turned away and walked out of the office, and she did not have it in her to stop him. She reached a hand up to feel sweat come out from her pores. What was that she just saw? Itaka's heart was beating inside, ferocious anger, the kind he had never felt before. It pumped poison into his heart as rain stung his skin with tiny, skin-hurting bites. The child had trodden too far into the dark. How would he pull him back this time? He grimaced, teeth clenching as rain poured down on him hard. His steps were quick and swift, eyes watching as rain dug deep ruts into the ground of the garden. He did not stick around to see them beat down the child lilies into a deep bow. He walked to the room and saw nothing but red now, his anger, immense. He did not want to unleash it on the child, but his wildness had wounded him this time. Was he aware of the severity of his mistake? Breaths sharply hissed from his lips when he heard the sounds of Karen's giddy laughter float to him from the room. When Itaka pushed open the door, dripping and cold, all of them went silent. The fire in his eyes blazed lively, and he directed all of its intensity towards Suzuki, watching as he slowly rose to his feet, trying hard to hide the look of a child awaiting punishment at his hands. Leave, Itaka hissed, and his voice oozed malevolence. No one argued at the sight of his warped countenance. Kai bowed and left the room. Karen hesitated for a moment, but she, too, left with a reluctant "you." The door closed behind them, and the sounds of their steps on the soaked wood dimmed and vanished in the storm. Suzuki took 2 steps forward and blinked. He wanted to say something. I would have, and he could not speak any more as Itaka struck him across the face with an open palm. The strength was such that Suzuki stumbled back and tasted his own blood. His lip was split open and his vision swayed. Anger boiled to the brim, red bloomed in Suzuki's eyes. He raised his face to glare. When Itaka struck him again, Suzuki almost lost his balance this time and a metallic, warm taste filled his mouth. Yet Itaka was unrelenting as he struck him again, first on the right cheek and then on the left. The last one beat the wild nature out of him. His head jerked and he collapsed onto his knees, wheezing. He was hungry, thirsty, and he was sick. The marks burnt raw, but the shame burned him without measure. Sasuke sat like this for some moments, vision swirling, breathing heavy and strained. Itachi's violence had popped open the flesh inside his cheeks. He did not have it in him to bear his fury, his beatings. His fever was rising, sizzling his flesh from the inside, that he puffed and blew now. Sasuke felt a cold hand brush against his throat, and he was lifted up by his dirty collar to stand on his feet. He braved a glance up into his brother's wicked eyes, carrion eaters of his dreams. His vision dimmed for a moment, and a terrible silence descended on him. His brother's face. Sasuke had never seen such anger etched in his face, not even on that night when he had broken his bones and pride in the dark that swallowed up his screams and misery without reluctance. Itachi looked murderous as though he was about to take his life. "What did you do?" Itachi asked, and his low voice tapered off to a cool hiss, and for the first time in his short life, Sasuke saw his lips vibrate with anger. "What did you do?" He asked again and appeared almost confused as he lifted Sasuke further up, and his feet could not quite find purchase on the warmed wooden floor. Itachi's hand traversed his throat, and he applied a little pressure as if he was endeavoring to choke the fight out of him. The younger one had nothing to say. His tongue battled silence, and his heart thumped wildly against his ribcage. It was no use, Itachi would never understand, he never could. A bright light flickered out of Itachi's eyes, and Sasuke's body trembled. It had awoken Sasuke out of his stupefaction. Sasuke tried to touch the floor, but only his toes tips felt the polished wood's smoothness. Itachi raised his head, stretched his neck just like a crow, and beheld his sibling's gaze, replete with the innocence from childhood. "What did you do?" Itachi shouted in his face this time, and he had never heard him shout for as long as he could recall. He had never heard him shout. Itachi's lips had gone red with the heat of an angry blood, and lost was the languid coolness it was typically accustomed to. "Let go!" Sasuke snarled this time, his fury matching his. Sasuke pushed him back with all his strength. Itachi's grip slackened, Sasuke fell back and almost tumbled down to the floor, but he regained his balance. His legs were tired and they threatened to give way. He placed his hand on the wall for support and listened to the subdued shriek from thunder. "Did you kill Toroin?" Itachi asked, and he was so quick to remedy the patient rest of silence. The lantern's light spilt on Sasuke, and he was remorseless. The bruises glowed a fierce red on his cheeks. He was overtaken by anger now. "Damn you!" Sasuke hissed and straightened his back. Red crawled down his chin and dripped down to the floor and left little traces on his white toes, too. He spat out the blood and returned the bold gaze to his brother's fury-loving face. "Why did you do this when I told you not to? How could you? How dare you?" Itachi spoke, and his voice was sharp like a cutting blade that was without feeling. Sasuke sat down, his legs had lost the strength to support him. "I have nothing to say to you. If you think I should be put to death, then let them take me. I don't care. Get the fuck out of my sight out." He rasped, his voice approaching a feral growl, and then he smiled and showed Itachi a face that wore a child's wild innocence upon it without the burden of shyness. Itachi did not speak. He clenched his fingers into terrible fists. His emotions' ferocity had not subsided, but the sight of Sasuke cooled its fire. The air was keen in its search of his anger. It was not lost, nor thawed, and if he stayed here, he would be so unkind to him. "You wicked child." Itachi spoke, voice heavy as he watched Sasuke put his forehead on his knees after he squeezed his thighs together. Unable to calm the heart anymore, Itachi turned away and approached the door. Sasuke's voice stopped him. "You look just like Oto-sama." Sasuke's words floated to him from the vast obscurity of silence. The storm was spent, thunder quiet, and those words had just driven out Itachi's anger. Chapter 59, Dead Men Don't Talk. Dark of the night, the bamboo grove, flooded with bright light, a full moon had risen over that spot. Shadows, behind their backs and white sparkled off the glassy masks on their faces. They had a peculiar sheen to them that made the red marks more apparent. In the darkness, they were black figures, billowing shadows wrapped round the bodies. The only features discernible about their constitutions were the moon-punctuated fox, cat, monkey, and rabbit faces, a make-believe visage, but that was what Umbu stood for, a shroud for friend and foe, made by devils' natures. There was nothing more to say on the matter. Their countenances, dark and jovial and thoughtfully benign, whatever the mask pretended to exhibit, it was meant to conceal the means. Stern or afraid, a foe was never meant to know a secret. Steadily, they ran over water that had gathered on the ground after storms. No one heard a splash. They were meant to approach the foes without a sound. They jumped over the stream, landing on a pebble-riddled slush of wet earth and rain. Their legs bent slightly on touchdown, a soundless leap, but the last man made a generous splash when his feet braced the ground. All of them stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence befell the place where they now stood. They gazed back at him, their eyes, various accusatory bright dots in the masks, and the man ran a hesitant hand across the bristles of tawny hair on his head. A nervous laugh rumbled behind the rabbit mask. He might have been embarrassed, but it was difficult to tell. His visage wore an obnoxious smile on its shiny features. The quietest man in front spun away and burst into a run. His feet did not touch the ground as he ran at top speed for the valley jammed between two steep, smooth-faced mountains. Faceless giants, they loomed over the land. Others followed in his wake and strained themselves to match his speed. Two men pounded side by side over the hard earth, with three more at their heels. Rains had left this place alone. Black frames melded into a large shadow and kept pressing onto the gorge, flanked by the granite walls ahead. One by one, they leapt into the murky bowls, putting Chakra under their feet to skid safely down the bone-crushing and slick flank of the hill. It merged at the bottom with another one to form a deep round crater that was full of sludge, made from ugly shadows. Red flickered on in the slits of the masked man who was still ahead of the group. Feeling the powerful ripple of Chakra from his body, another pair burnt red in the fox mask. He could not see the eyes, but he could almost feel their intensity in the Chakra the man exuded, so he chased him, hoping to match his pace and shadow. It was his dream to run ahead of him, beat him, earn the much-coveted blessings of his father even in spirit. Yet, at that moment, it was merely a passing thought that cost him a part of a moment. His eyes saw the movements before the man made them. He was about to leap off the flank. He did the same, following the direction of his jump to land onto the branches, engulfed in complete darkness beyond the crater. The men behind him did the same and followed like good, obedient soldiers. That was what they were trained for, that was what their purpose in life was. They were meant to follow. Their thoughts and desires were obsolete in their lives. Nothing mattered before the will. Nothing. A fleeting, delicate mist permeated the space, and a smell of damp rot rushed in their direction. They had probably crossed rain's border. A pattering sound came to their ears, and the smell became stronger. It rained hard with the arrival of autumn in this village. Mist, desperate and porous, was trying to reform itself over and over again, but it was all for naught. He knew it was a hopeless struggle. Soon, he felt the rain on the back of his neck and arms. Black hairs had traversed his pale forehead, and the wetness there made them stick to the damp skin. Cool raindrops had gotten through the mask slits. The thing was hardly waterproof. Overhead, dense branches, ripe with flora, had burst into bloom during the rains. His Sherinan saw the pretty colors and Chakra and their Venus petals and branches. In this gloomy season of mist and autumn, a scene of spring had survived. The deep ground was choked with thick mud, and everywhere, unsheared shrubs had grown into massive mounds of tangled twigs and leafy boughs. Colorful flowers popped out from the sludge at the foot of trees. The ground would drink it good come morning. It was only a matter of time. Why, he did not know why he was following him. Why? He was asked to. It was a command that demanded utmost obedience. He had to cringe before him, put aside his natural closeness, and uphold the request like nothing else mattered. His heart had beaten in such protest. They were close, but he had to obey him like this daily. His father had perished years ago, so he answered to him now, just him, only him. Yet now was not the time to play family. It was a duty bestowed upon him, and he had to see it through to the end. He was asked. Then he had to do as he was told, and he had asked of him to follow and stay silent and only observe, without any wild interferences, as he had stated, a strange selection of simple commands. Yet why did it matter? That was how they all learnt. It was beaten into their heads till it became a second habit to their bodies: obey the command, sneak past the enemy, cut down the foes like unwary cattle. It was simple as a mechanism that drove men, hungry dogs led barking and slavering in chase of meaty bones. Simple rules. Simple consequences. That was all in the life of an shinobi. No unnecessary questions tripped from their tongues. They had to train them, rein their wild heads towards silence's gates to keep the unpleasant words to themselves, bury them deep into their breasts whence no whisper escaped the spirit that naturally sought its freedom. No, like the man it possessed till death did them part, it was created to hope for the hopeless. Shrugging off the menacing feeling, he looked ahead. He was meant to chase and aim ahead. That was what he had trained himself to do, and that was what he would do. A grey wind pushed him back, but he was no child. His feet were cold, but he kept leaping from one branch to the next to catch up to him. The distance was reduced, or the man had slowed down, he could not say. It was always hard to tell what he was thinking. Rain hit his skin hard like little pebbles. The gaps between the branches above his head had widened. They provided very little cover now. The noise was rising to a loud crescendo. There was not going to be any respite for them tonight. Suddenly, the swift man in front jumped down and ran into the dark and crooked trees. They, too, went behind him. Slithering across the sopping wet patch of grass, they came upon a muddy clearing under the full moon. Rain had pounded the flowers into the ground and dug up the vulnerable earth. The hard-packed one next to the moss-encrusted stones lay untouched. A rotten odor rose with persistence about them. It was not a pleasant smell. A pearly mist rose unabated as the rain thinned, and this time, it was a clear, thin pall that spread over the space. The man in front suddenly stopped and they did the same, looking around curiously to peer into the shapeless mass of many shadows. Foes could be hidden behind the slanting trees. Some had learned clever tricks to extinguish their chakra. Only the red eyes were blessed with the power to sniff out such wicked tricksters, sensing always failed them. Rain's sound mellowed, tinkling like coins on the stone's slick surfaces. Deep fissures adorned their forms, fungi grew in between them as viscous and thick green surprise that gave off a musky scent he could smell from several feet away. The air was filled thick with it. Persistent storms had given them a fertile ground to germinate and spread. It was piled on the base of the trees, a thick slime. An odd place for a short respite, he did not understand. Swiftly, the silent man's hand flickered to the hilt on his back, and he vanished with great speed that he barely saw him move. His Sherry-non had failed him. Again. A slow, burning resentment rose as a torrent in his breast, but it was quickly overcome by shock as he saw blood fly up into the damp air, hot plumes from the cuts in the men's throats. Severed necks tipped back with unnatural shudders, and one crackled to the right and fell off to the ground like a ball, bouncing once on the soggy grass before hitting the puddle of mud with a dull splash. The rabbit mask slowly came off and revealed the smiling and confused face of a man he had never seen before. He did not even get a chance to taste death, and it consumed him. His head bobbed grotesquely in the mud, and a few bubbles rose to the surface and popped there as his final exhalation. Then the ghastly face turned a little to the left and sank below the surface. Now, he could only see the tawny, prickly hair on the head. The flak jackets were soaked red, happy masks, streaked with fresh blood. Even the rain was not strong enough to wipe them clean. Blood's metallic stench nearly overpowered the fungi's smell. His hand went to the slits on the mask to press against the porcelain surface. He could still smell it, rotten, disgusting, revolting. He squeezed his eyes shut, terror giving way to shock. What? What had he done? He pulled off the mask slowly and watched as the quiet killer knelt by a dead man, whose face was still smiling obnoxiously in death, and he was forced to suppress the ghost of a laugh that rippled humorlessly in his throat. He was almost disgusted with himself. The man raised his head and observed his white face that was pelted relentlessly by rain. He wore a smiling face of a fox, pink lines running down the sides. An uncharacteristically mild blush rose in his cheeks in response to the rain, chakra-excited blood defiant in his veins. It was bitterly cold, and a soft admiration fled in panic from his countenance. He stared in open-mouthed horror at the corpses and gulped down the raindrops as they went into his mouth. The fox-faced man slowly rose to his feet in a dignified and resilient manner. His bearing was stern, sure, deadly. The sword was held in his slackened grip. It returned the murky reflection of his young face and red eyes behind a clear and smooth layer of rainwater that went trailing down its edges. It was clean now, washed of all the sins and all the bloods. Red had disappeared into the welcoming, and forever greedy, earth of this village. There was a little of it left now in the flak jacket's fibers. That, too, would surely disappear soon. The man's hand reached to his back and sheathed the sword with a sharp, cutting sound as it filled the sheath completely. Then his hand went to the smiling face that mocked the dead and pulled the layer away to reveal a young man's sober countenance that was unsmiling, another mask. Long tear lines were etched into his face like a memory. A smile ghosted over his face, touching the deadly eyes. And they softened almost instantly, melting the red there to return to the deep dark, with which he was familiar. He walked to him and stopped, still smiling as though he had not killed them without a heart. His hand reached sluggishly for his wet hair, and he stroked his head very affectionately and spoke in a voice that sounded strange in the soul-chilling moment that followed the slaughter. "Come, Suzuki. We must not linger here." Then he put the mask and the fox smile back on and started walking back to Leaf. Suzuki looked to the darkest shadows that lay about in the mud, lifeless, and the perfect, theatric expressions on the stained masks almost about to burst into a delirious laugh at the fates of foolish umbu men who wore them. But dead men did not talk. They did not laugh. They did not smile. And then he stared at his beloved brother's back in equally long measures. He did not understand him at all. Those were the days he had spent in umbu training. A spat or two with his brother earned him a lifelong removal from umbu division. It was but a dream now. Suzuki sighed, shoulders slumping a little with fatigue, but he straightened his back when the deep voice of his brother broke him out of his reverie. He blinked, eyes tired, and tried to get accustomed to the dark room. Sparse light emerged from a lantern set before his brother, Itaki, in weak waves that folded in smoothly against the darkness. Partition screens lay quiet, donning the councilmen's shadows. They were beautiful and exquisite, painted in delicate brush strokes to create flames and dragons roaring in silence, lost voices, quiet sounds, calm thunder in the breasts of inky men and beasts and storms. A man sitting beside Suzuki spoke, his voice rough and strained. He did not heed his words as he was distracted by a bold autumn moth wriggling into the room through a tiny gap in the paper screen. Morning's wind had cut into it with a bitter assault. Its delicate wings fluttered in nervous haste as it struggled to find the right air current for flight. Its wings looked mighty as a growing shadow that intruded upon the empty space with a weightless drape little thing, so threatening in dark's grip. It finally located its path, hesitated for a moment, and then it mounted upon the air thread suffused with chakra. It adored as though it were its own. Suzuki's gaze followed its path. It was being pulled to the source by a string he could barely see, despite passion's rise in his eyes. It settled down on Itaka's shoulder and went behind his back, wings moving in delight now that it had found its mark. Its shadow merged with Itaka's defined one, and they became one, and it seemed to him that his brother had grown wings, too. Black hair streamed over his brother's shoulders in the manner of a king's son many moons past. His clan had not thrown away their traditions. Itaki had chosen to leave his hair open tonight, sinister black framed the winter white that shone, sickly brilliance of a man's skin barely approximating flesh. His haori was expensive, eyes sober, and when he spoke, his voice was a cold and gentle breeze over water. Actor, trickster, liar. Red, a stagnant pool in the younger one's eyes and face, mischievousness and anger hiding beneath the shadows, eyes peeking out from an innocence-cherishing countenance, looking out through the gloom that rose. His brother's gaze had not answered his this time, blind to his plight and misery as always. Anger had not let go of Suzuki's spirit, it never could, never should. Suzuki turned his face away and hid it below shadows waves that still remained, relentless in their pursuit of being armed rebels that fought a losing battle, a proud hunter running in the gloam, chasing after shadows in the dimming light. Soon, they would merge and a shapeless fate would befall them for another night. Dusk broke them free, and they rose, passion and vengeance in their breasts. Murmurs rose and fell, yet his heart was a quiet place of silenced thoughts. He did not want to think with tongues lest their whispers be heard by his brother's all-heeding ears. He sat cross-legged, weary. Then he bent forward, rested his elbows on his knees and forehead in his right hand. Hidden behind the looming shadows, Itaka's eyes could not have seen his relaxed posture. He sat far away from him, left to fume and worry behind men that mattered tonight. Hushed voices continued, dangling there in the air, weightless. Footsteps moved on his right and on his left. All of them had come to gaze upon the new head from another city in the Fire Country, from nooks and corners of this village, half-breeds in tow. His gaze was in darkness. He chose majestic silence in the arms of a stubborn anger that, too, had its own merits, remnant of pride, gristle of arrogance. Thoughts drifting further into the past's domain, on timid steps they trod, and he found himself nearly peeking into his father's room. There he would sit, back to him and all of his little world. A light blinked against the draft behind his Oto-sama's back. Mikoto had gone out to wait for Itaki in the garden. His little shadow lingered a moment too long, and his father looked over his shoulder, red diminishing from his face, lips parting in the room's haze to speak his name, Suzuki. Suzuki, are you ill? He asked, a shadow's lips moving. He could not see him that clearly. He was always hidden from his gaze and his heart. His small heart was set to a quicker pace and its voice rose to a falsetto. Suzuki, are you ill? He spoke again, and this time, his thoughts were broken, and a little spill from light invaded the cover his hand assured. Suzuki pulled his hand away and gazed. The room was empty. They had left, all of them, and discarded odors from traditional perfumes and smells imparted by dyes, in new cloths inside the room. The vibrancy of color had dispersed from the room like the smells. Silence approached, a menacing presence. His brother spoke again, and his tone was like their father's. Itaka sounded just like their father. It was as though his words had the serrated teeth of resemblance, and now, they gnawed at the base of his spine. He pretended not to heed his father's voice-stealing sibling and slowly rose to his feet and threw away the mist's cloak from his shoulders. Incense smoke was still coming from the pots as twisting lines. Suzuki's gaze roamed the room, roamed the darkness beyond Itaka's shoulders. It slept in Itaka's eyes, beneath the black smear that lay upon his face still. Suzuki saw it wriggling now, and he felt sick to his stomach. Anger should never make you blind to your health, Itaka spoke, his voice a breath on ice against his shivering body. Then, before he could move, Itaki rose to his feet with a regal bearing, garments trailing in his wake as he approached him, dragging the shadows of wings in his wake. He walked with the quietest grace that the wooden floor absorbed any evidence of his presence. Itaka's face came into the light, and Suzuki took in the countenance of a man who was as merciless as he was perfect, his brother, his tormentor, his father. For a moment, he was left tongueless by this new visage of royal mockery, bewitched by this wicked grace he knew to be an act, a personification of outward perfection and other convenience. Fuck him. He almost hissed, unashamed by the bitterness that ran amok in him. Are you still angry that your eyes do not thaw? He asked, voice unchanging, mien shrouded in steely indifference. At that moment, from the wounds that stayed fresh, something akin to dark despair crept slowly up the length of his spine, and he was suddenly fearless in the face of his brother. I hate your cold and smug face. An entire council under your thumb hope you're proud of yourself, Suzuki said, sounding rough, face betraying defiance and anger. Itaka did not move an eyebrow. His face was still the same, frozen in an expression that guarded his thoughts well. Itaka considered Suzuki for a moment, and his eyes drifted to the sweat gathering copiously at Suzuki's still shivering nape. Whether he was afraid or feverish, Itaka could not say. Your little fury. Itaka spoke, and his eyes glimmered, fire in the tempering dark, a manifestation of his usual aloofness. Are you not content that I took you out of the prison? You wanted to rot in there just to get back me? You child. He smiled just at the corners of his mouth, and his smile was such that it appeared equally exquisite and frigid. This angered Suzuki even more. You did this, Suzuki hissed, and a black anger filled his face, a whirlpool of fury sending flashes racing towards the back of his eyes that they burnt brighter, fiercer than usual. You saved her. Did you ask Kai to protect that wench? Are you fucking her? Itaka's placid eyes reflected no anger at his remark, though his ghost smile slowly faded away right before his eyes. The dark was palpable about him now and fluttered, impatient, like shadow's wings. You have become a sponge for boorish remarks. I knew, it was a mistake to let you mix with the runts from Rain, Itaka spoke, and his matter-of-fact manner of speech was as harsh as ever. Anger lashed Suzuki's bones and furious tremors rushed through his blood in violent waves. He craned his neck and looked Itaka straight in his eyes that beheld him through the grey of mist and supreme lens of authority. "Are you?" His asked again, and his eyes widened to show him the red that nearly spilt over to consume the white there. "You have no taste." "Just what I'd expect from Leaf's dog, you always were so common." The venom in his words gave an unexpected shock to Itaka's senses. Suddenly, there was fire in his black eyes that cut through the unwavering cool upon his visage like a deadly blade. His brow furrowed, and almost by reflex, his hand shot forward and a fierce grip grasped the back of Suzuki's neck with a force that, for a moment, the hollow at the base of his throat pulsed, jumping as though he had been puffing through a fierce run to elude his foes. "Your language is coarse." Itaka paused and drew a slow breath to calm his temper. "Vulgar. Have you no shame?" Light sparked in the dark outside and flowed in through the barrier of paper screens. It illuminated Suzuki's red eyes more and the side of his sweaty face. He did not seem intimidated. His heart was his only betrayer as it throbbed in his visible veins, a show for spectators. To Itaka, he was a child who had not even begun to sprout. "Let go," Suzuki hissed, a clear warning, innocent face warping in anger and defiance, lips shaking with a hot fury to match his brother's cold passions. He was not backing down. Itaka's eyes glided across his features that had not returned to the state he preferred in the face of his changing demeanor, but he himself had calmed down. It was a sudden reflex action, and he was quick to recover from that unnecessary slip. His grip slackened, hand pulled away from Suzuki's neck, and he backed away wordlessly. "I have not touched that girl," Itaka spoke in a softer tone this time. "Would this confession satisfy you?" He straightened his back and slipped his hands into the long and luxurious sleeves. "Liar," Suzuki accused in the same tone of voice as he glared at him with upturned eyes. "Kai wouldn't have done anything had it not been for you. Do you think I'm a fool? You've ruined everything. You're a liar." Suzuki stepped a little to the right and came into the bowing combers of light. His eyes appeared all the brighter with the dark behind his back now. More light came forth that ran from the belly of the clouds with loud, shattering steps. It would rain again tonight. Autumn had overstayed its welcome this time, winter's hand had not attained the strength to overwhelm it yet. "Why are you consumed by anger?" Itaka asked, and the cool tone of his voice remained unchanged. "What worries you now? Are you dissatisfied with your easy release? Do you always crave punishment? I must confess, I am not equipped with the means to grant you the thrills you crave. Forgive your brother." His demeanor now was the perfect distillation of his sanctimonious nature, his condescending talk, indifferent face, commanding bearing. All of this, to Suzuki, was a perfect fit that he could not help but smile at this meticulous facade of illusions. What a trickster his brother was. "Look at you," Suzuki began, a contemptuous curl of disdain showing itself on his softer features with haste, red rising in tow along the contours of his cheeks, the same sanctimonious tone, the same tongue coming from you. "It's funny." Itaka replied with silence, and his gaze crawled off Suzuki's face to find a distraction in the painting hanging in the alcove. It was drenched in shadow's paints. The sword stand before it was dark and black, he could not see the fine hilts. Red would have to mate with the black in his gaze to see through the rapturous curtains of haze. "You're just like Oto-sama," Suzuki said, and his lips were dry, voice so low that Itaka's eyes moved back to him with a sudden swiftness. The mood in his gaze's impenetrable depth metamorphosed very slowly into something unreadable. "He was your architect. Nothing about you is different, just as insufferable as he was. It hurts me cause," he stopped, breath scalding his throat, "I loved him." Suzuki turned his face away as a sheen came across his eyes. Itaka was still quiet, face expressionless, eyes empty. He was looking at Suzuki now, heart sturdy in the grip of control. The shadow falling on Suzuki was thick now. A lamp had died behind Itaka's back, but his shadow's perch on Suzuki's body was always assured. The spacious room boasted high ceilings and the walls were quiet as monks vowed to silence. Stillness and dark germinated unchecked with no bright hands to smother them now. "I won't let you," Suzuki stopped to clench his jaws harder, "become the architect of my life. I won't." Then he looked to Itaka, red stabbing through dark, bleeding its bosom with no guilt. "Did you kill Torun?" Itaki asked, and his lips curved a little so wickedly. You never told me why you were seen in the woods, caught red-handed in the act. You child, you sweet child. You try so hard to hide things from me. Tell me, why would you take that fool's life? Anger burnt in Suzuki's body, gaudily advertised by the nature of his eyes, nature of an Uchiha, red was passion, and free was its nature and freer, its love's fearless. What's it to you? He asked, knowing full well that Itaka's demeanor was training itself into something he would not enjoy, but so rebellious was he that he did not care. He would speak of what was in his heart, fear of the older one was but a burden he had grown accustomed to, a second nature to him now. Itaka took one slow step to become a darker looming figure before him, and his eyes changed to battle Suzuki's red this time, his seemingly off-world attire, luxuriant hair mixing and diluting into the dark with perfection that the only remnants of a man on his whole form. Were the nature of his eyes, a sudden tremor gripped Suzuki's legs, but he held his ground. He would not let him win this time. It is everything to me, Itaka spoke, and his voice did not betray any contempt, but his eyes. Sharp, dangerous like an all-consuming fire. You will do well to remember my words. I warned you last time that I will not be kind if you disobeyed me again. You took the life of that man, plunged yourself into another mess I will have to clean up this time. I want your little game to end. Now. Itaka's last word was a barely coherent hiss, and red flared brighter in his eyes to punctuate his point. Suzuki slightly flinched, and his hackles rose at the sight of fury his brother exuded, but he had more to spare. Why don't you prove it? He spat with a clenched hand, a vein trembling visibly in his neck, defiant like he. Is that how you want to play this? This is not a game. End this self-indulgence, or what? Suzuki challenged him and betrayed an ugly derision in his voice, his face, a visage of such fury. Or I will make you end this, Itaka warned, and there was no hostility in his plain tone, but when he bent his face forward into the light, as though he wanted Suzuki to see his changed countenance, his face and eyes were cold as death. Seeing that uncaring and furious mien, Suzuki's indignation rose. He would rather urinate on his parents' graves than let Itaki have his way again. I'd rather choose the company of root dogs poking inside my head than let you do as you please, Suzuki said, voice pregnant with a melody born from rebelliousness. Quiet, Itaka spoke in his deep, threatening voice commanded authority. The smooth shadow of wings expanded behind his back, wider and wider, till he was a crow with a human face. His white cheek in the light was without a hue, a deathly face shrouded in a cloak without color, sinister wings behind him. He stepped closer, and Suzuki was in half a mind to bolt from the room, fly away from him, his wings, escalating beak, but Suzuki's pride disallowed him to cringe before Itaka now in servility, so he watched, with near fascination, this new face of his beloved brother, light behind him dimmed in envy, sky glared in anger at his lovely and ugly perfection that was displayed before Suzuki in all its wicked glory naked, shameless, rapturous. You end this now, child. Do not test me. Itaka's voice fell over his face in soft waves and mocked him in the most profound manner. I know what you did back when you'd started your captaincy in Umbu, Suzuki whispered, tone struggling in the shackles of anger and fear. You slaughtered a whole village to protect this one men, women, children. You're cruel, remorseless, unkind. You care about no one but yourself. You don't know how I feel because you have no heart. You make me sick, and I can't stand the sight of you. You're an animal at the end of the council's leash. That's all you are, that's all you ever will be. Suzuki's eyes were fires in the dark, but his insolent words had sent a vivid arc flying across Itaka's eyes, and such was his anger that he saw nothing but red haze now. Itaka's face slinked back into the dark once more as if he wanted to hide his features from Suzuki, and red ripened to shurikens in his eyes, they had betrayed him before a breath came from his lips. The sharp ends of his fingers dug into his wrist inside the right sleeve, enough to bruise, to assuage his burning anger. A spurt of blood came out from his left eye's tear duct that was hidden in the blackness, expressing fury which his Sherry-non could not. At that moment, before Itaka could succumb to anger and inflict punishment upon his younger sibling, the door opened and Yu stepped in with Kai in his wake. His gaze left Suzuki's strained face and settled on the timid medic who seldom talked and always obeyed. Get him out of my sight before anger gets the better of me, Itaka spoke without looking at Suzuki, voice firm, unwavering. Yu bowed meekly, approached Suzuki, and took him out of the room. Suzuki's weak state was enough that he did not protest. He walked away, leaving Itaki and Kai to stand in silence. Outside, Wind was a wild child that scampered across the garden. Itaka-sama, a letter came from the Hokage. She requests your presence in her office, Kai informed and pulled out an official scroll from his pocket. When Itaka did not speak, he stooped down and placed it on the table by the unlit lantern. Then he bowed and left the room quietly. It was silence now, disturbed by Autumn's unending wild nature. He looked down at the scroll, reached up, smoothly wiped away the love-quenched tear from his cheek. The moth had flown away, and he had not even noticed it. It fed on his chakra, ripened its belly, and now, it was as deadly as ever. When he opened the door to Tsunade's office, he was a different man, hair neatly combed back, expressions subtle, body clothed in umbu uniform's superficial glory. Her office was a room that wore pallid lights habitually. She was an odd one. When he closed the door, she got distracted by the click and looked up from the scroll. Her lips did not smile this time, and there was darkness behind her eyes that foretold her unease. "Why have you called me here at this time of the hour?" Itaki asked, looking a little weary. These back-and-forth meetings and unwinnable quarrels with the little one had sapped him of energy. "This came from the daimyo's councilman," she said in a worried voice and placed the scroll on the table for him to take it. "I considered your vote. Shikaku and I voted in Suzuki's favor. Hayashi didn't. He remained neutral and useless. Danzo, however, went behind my back and contacted this wicked man. I can't override this. It's too soon." Itaka picked it up and read the contents. "Your private intelligence is useless," he spoke indifferently and his face suggested mild scorn. "Why show me this now when you have drowned the boy already? Do not think that you can force my hand. You will not get the scroll, not till you fix this mess. Hokage-sama." His face was black, eyes red again, his gaze's threats were predictable but no less fearsome. Tsunade knew she would not be able to parry the swords from his slippery gaze and tongue. She had to quell his rising wrath. She had to. "Are you blackmailing me? Without that scroll, all is lost. If you give it to me, I can apprehend Danzo and this," she said, but her tone lacked authority, it was laced with desperation as she endeavored to placate him. He was not moved. "Of course not," Itaka breathed out almost sweetly. "I lack the authority to force any decision upon you. I killed a girl on your orders. Imagine the mess if her thugs knew of your hastiness. They play well with mist and cloud. What a glorious mess that would create." And his eyes were smiling, cherry non burning exquisitely on his face, a gaudy show of seduction. He placed the scroll back on the table and spoke no more. Goose flesh erupted across her tingling skin. His words had made her mind reel madly. What was he suggesting? A war? Surely, a radical like he did not value Suzuki this much. His words had bitten off her tongue, and she had no words to spare. He made to leave, but turned around to add, "It was Sakura, was it not?" Her student's name made her momentarily recover. She gritted her teeth, angry at his boldness, and said, "Of course not." Itaka merely smiled, and his eyes darkened in the slightest. Then he left her office almost soundlessly. Outside, Winds had gone to sleep, lying in the embrace of a momentary lull. His energy was gone when he reached home. He did not know what to do. He wanted to visit the graveyard, but it was raining outside now. They could wait, dead men had nowhere to run. He opened the door to the room that held Suzuki captive. A fire burnt with a tender glow in the fireplace, it was warm. Suzuki was lying prone beneath the cake butin. Itaka sat down cross-legged beside the futon and still Suzuki did not stir. He was fast asleep, his anger gone in slumber. You had not neglected his duties, the sleeping draught was strong enough not to rouse the little one. Itaka laced his fingers through the sweaty hair lying on Suzuki's neck and stroked his head very slowly as though he was putting a distressed child to sleep. He had no stories to tell this time. His tongue was silent, heart-weary. Suzuki's anger had given him no chance for even a little display of affection. What had he done? The child had grown disobedient, wild, insolent, and he did not know what to do. Itake moved the hair to the side and pulled the high collar back to gaze upon the bruise left by the collar. Suzuki was so stubborn that he had disallowed you to even heal it. The prison guards had not bothered to take up the excess slack. Had Suzuki been left there longer, Itake did not have it in him to imagine that scenario anymore. "You child," Itake whispered, not ceasing his loving caresses. Light silently flashed in the sky, but wind laughed in jovial abandon, elated at its call. A flash lit up Tsunade's office and her hand jerked in surprise and sake slopped over the edge of her glass. Thunder's roar chided the wind. It was the tinkle of rain now. She pressed her hand over her bosom and took a little sip to lighten her stress. Her thoughts were still in pursuit of Itake's words when the door opened. Danzo came from the darkness and stopped before the door, his deep eyes indiscernible in the shadows. Her anger mounted and knew no bounds. She slammed down the glass on the table and it wobbled. She did not care how the red spilt over her scrolls. "Get out of here, you snake!" Tsunade shouted and red rose in her cheeks. "How dare you go behind my back and shame me like this? I know you. What do you want with that boy? How could you come up with this scheme?" She stopped and her voice became silence. Out of the darkness, from behind Danzo's evil shadow, emerged Sakura, her expression meek, gait unsure. "Your student is the one who testified against that treacherous Uchiha child," Danzo spoke, and his voice was like venom that burnt on her skin. "Sakura? You?" Tsunade's wits left her. She could not believe her eyes. Itake would kill her if he knew. What had she done? Chapter 60, Children Don't Do Naughty Things. Curiosity, a terrible creature, it trod where it knew not to go, but when through the changing seasons hearts and limbs grew, it prodded the spirit on to look for treasures and find new things, innocent things, to explore and touch. He, too, had been an explorer in his childhood. He, too, had trodden far down the road of curiosity. He had met a girl child in his childhood years that were fraught with curiosities. Her downy cheeks were covered in rich bloom, always, and one day, beneath the moving shadows of dried-up trees, she had asked of him to explore her between the thighs. It was the strangest request, yet he was a sober and questing child to not turn her down, so he took her to a quiet garden behind the elder's house, her plump hand in his, where slips of black and white and red fish moved beneath the clear water, and signs of trees were thick and intruding. There she sat on the stone slab by his side, eyes shining in the autumn sun's gleams, lips that seemed to pout for a little kiss. Her arms stretched out to hold him in a sacred embrace. He had denied her a kiss on the mouth, her rosy lips plucked at the flesh on his neck instead. Taking a whiff of a noxious oil of pleasures, he buried his face in her hair. Innocent pleasures, young flesh. His hand, unsure of its path, went underneath layers of her red yukata to explore the plump thighs that had a tinge of pink and a bloom of budding youth. Shadows moved, here and there, and deepened between her legs to hide her anatomy. She had swooned in girlish rapture, lashes flickering like moth's wings upon the cheeks that tinted a darker shade, and titled her head back to rest it on his shoulder. His fingers connected with smooth and swollen fleshes that oozed mucus at touch. He glided them down to the slippery groove, and she breathed heavily into his ear, whimpering with please, her breaths, hot and needy. His flesh, still slumbering between his own thighs, became lively at her sounds as though they were guiding it to ripen with soft strokes, and he craved more. His finger wormed and explored the flesh inside, moist, tight, hot, and he felt his pores expel sweat, veins flicker with undulations of his heart's unsure nature, his thoughts exploring new things with him inside this clammy tightness to experience true bliss. Her body shivered, experienced waves of something unknown to her budding form, and went through a timid metamorphosis that would need to be repeated for the contentment of her baser desires, and in an earnest response to the ministrations of an innocent hand, a warm wetness seeped into his palm, and a sudden jolt of heat went to the core of his pleasures. His body, then, cooled off in a sudden effort to move away from that heated state. His flesh had turned distant between his legs, too. She opened her eyes, as though waking from a trance, gaze heavy with the drunkenness of her first release. Her eyes, and their endless depths after the bliss, fascinated him. There was a release of a shade, of deep intoxication, in her eyes that had risen from the maw with thrums from her heart and flesh and bones, a sinister rhythm in that young apparel that rattled his bones with a lovely vibration. Eyes told a person's tale, after all. He could have asked of her to lie supine, in silence, on the yellowed grass, open her wet thighs wide, allow him to intrude upon that place over and over again to his heart's content, but his passion was thawed by the evening air. Her cheeks were still ruddy like roses, but her body was cast in the roof's shadows. It was getting dark. So he left that garden, fingers still coated with her arousal, heart and loins impatient, her hand in his as they walked on a path between the sighing autumn trees. When they stopped by her house, which was under the night's cover, she stood on her toes to whisper, "I enjoyed it. Can we do it again, Itake?" Then she backed away, cheeks glowing crimson in the lantern's bright light, face eager. He peered deep into her eyes, but that shade had faded to dimness, and so had his curiosity. He did not say anything to wound her heart and walked into the embracing arms of a silent dark that sat between him and his home. He wanted to speak to his father of these things, things that governed a body's more sinister half, but he was a boy of 11 still. His father's eyes were stern enough to halt his steps, too young and childlike to be embroiled into the tempest of flesh's lure, and Suzuki was still so young, a babe of 3. What would he say to him? He played in his lap in the sun's dimming lights, cradling lilies in his tender arms, crossed over his belly, eyes brightening in happiness. When one floated out of that heap, mounted on autumn's wings, Suzuki's face would crumple into a frown and lips would become redder in anger. Then he, after abandoning the rest, made a feeble effort towards the chase of it, but he was too young to pursue its path. After a little run through the decaying grass, his legs would grow tired, and he would look back at Itake's face through a sheen in his eyes. The lilies he abandoned had floated away, all of them. Such quests always left the babe on the verge of tears, and he was an impatient one. And his plump arms would stretch to meet the embrace of the older one. He always insisted that Itake should pluck new ones out. "Ni-san, that one," he would say in a small, pleading tone, eyes wet with new tears. Then the task of plucking lilies began anew, a warm smile coming to the younger one's face that his brother was doing what he had asked of him in the full moon's light. There they would tread amongst lilies and moths and shadows to locate the ones Suzuki loved. He adored the ones with the silkiest petals. Lilies swayed like weeds in the wind, whispered in voices, heralded the coming of a colder autumn that would be bereft of mercy and love. For leaf and its summers and springs. Suzuki loved to put one in Mikoto's hair, and her eyes always smiled in response to her little one's gestures of love. Itake found it strange, he had plucked so many, yet Suzuki would give them all to Mikoto but one. He saved that one for Itake, the brightest, silkiest one. Yet Suzuki, and his beautiful sincerity, was what Itake loved from the heart's depths, purity's eidolon that dwelt beside his spirit, and tender was its touch and presence in his mortal coil. It was an endless source of adoration and elation for its spirit, a food for his appeasement. The babe's smile, blushing upon his face with divinity, elated his heart that raced to joy's summit. It would become a chamber of very tender and blissful sounds in those moments. Yes, Suzuki was too small for such talks. He would never understand his baser curiosities, so in his heart he buried the temptation, and in his flesh he kept his lust. His tongue kept its promise to his flesh that it would never betray him before anyone. His secrets were his to keep and guard. As weeks floated by in a haze of autumn's decay and gloom, he had foregone the talks with his father and kept to himself. His early days in Umbu were thrilling, strange even. Sex was easy amongst the members, easier than murder. Umbu shinobi rented rooms wherever they wanted to rut excitable men and ripe women, promiscuous men and willing youths, heady women and giddy boys, buds of spring with older partners, too, mingled without a care. Itake found these liberties to be a matter of stranger things, but being so young, the prospect of bodily pleasures was an elusive idea. Women whispered things into his ears, but no one was brave enough to take an Uchiha heir to her bed. He could court one in his own clan, a silly and willing girl, but he did not desire the ire of elders lest he incurred a wave of shame for his father and censure for his unbecoming decision to soil a naive young girl. So, he, sometimes, snuck a hand into his trousers past the soft puff of hairs growing on his loins when the room's gloom draped his shaking body, enveloped in sweat to give his flesh a distinct sheen born of arousal, curved a hand around the flesh hardened by blood, and moved it up and down the length to relieve this annoyance that grew inside his body with each passing day, a tumorous growth that required a medicine for its unchecked spread. Autumn left and winter came, a chapter of death, but his body bloomed and ripened to a state of heated deliriousness. Spring had occurred in winter's decay. He wished to confide in his friend, Shisui, but the prospect of shame locked the words in his mouth. He could never give voice to his worries when he looked upon Shisui standing in the light spilling from the interstices between the frail boughs. Shisui was a boy of 16 and had reached the estate of a man by his clan's law. Itaka felt that he was so far behind, meandering in his wake to find the path. Yellow and red covered the ground, dead flowers strewn about in a sea of mist. That was when he had gone on a mission to spill blood in a village. He was tasked to kill a family of 3 brothers. His mission leader, Miura, was a hard man of 30, a jonin who had lived through many missions. His bearing was sure, his sword well used in battle. Sometimes, whilst they rested deep in the forest, he caught a whiff of a rusty smell from the steel when Miura cleaned it with oil. Sounds from dark and forest did not worry his heart, he was older for these small matters. "Does the darkness make you afraid?" Miura asked him one night, his face hidden in night, the visible eye housing a changing gleam Itaka had never seen there before. Plea. Lust? Itaka considered him for a moment, unable to read his strange glance. "No," he said as his cheeks glowed a tender red in the fire's light. His gaze beheld Miura's countenance, there was something almost fiendish about it. "You make noises in your bed." "Sometimes," Miura said with a little pause, his bearing wanton now, and there was much of that emotion in his eye that it threatened to spill over onto his face. A rude smile dangled from the corners of his sake-coated lips. He was a little intoxicated. "I don't see how that concerns your curiosity," he said, and watched Miura's brow frown that was half concealed by the messy brown hair that hung over it. His smile was vanishing. Then he left the place by the fire and slept in the natural cave in the tree's base. He lay on his back, turf pillowing his head, thinking. His eyes wandered for a brief moment to gaze at his superior, who still sat outside under the clear sky and in the company of blinking fireflies. Miura repulsed him. Days went by and winds blew harsh and winter settled deeply into Earth's limbs. He sent a letter to Shisui, requesting of him to follow his trail and assist him in this endeavor. Their journey was cursed by whippings from a tumultuous hand of storm. Trees thrashed and got torn up in the forest, and they were left with nary a choice. He got separated from his team of 4 men, and that was when in the cave's calm refuge, with his superior he felt his hand, with a bold motion, brush against his genitals. That action brought out an immediate reaction from Itaka's body. He shuddered, followed by a backwards stumble to press his back against the cave's rough wall, confused and shamed. His cheeks grew warmer, and he did not know how to respond to this invitation for copulation. Miura had cornered him in the cave, his body firmly pressed against his, and outside, a storm raged with ferocity, and inside, his blood boiled just the same. Miura's hand was fastened to his loins now, kneading the flesh through the thick material of his trousers to rouse it against his will, and Itaka's arm was in his tight grasp, fingers digging into the flesh that was white as winter's whisper. Itaka clenched his teeth, unable to voice the revulsion he felt. From this close, he could see sweat dotting the green veins that flickered and throbbed in tandem with the rising speed of Miura's beats, reaching up to his nape to visibly shiver there in a state of arousal. His breaths were hideous and hollow and smelt rank on his skin. "Allow me," he rasped against his ear, his breath soaked in strong sake. "You will enjoy it. Tell me, where do you want to be touched?" "I will." "Let me go." He hissed and shoved Miura back. He was a tall boy for his age and stood over 5 feet 4 inches. His limbs, though pliant, were strong. Miura staggered several steps back from the force of the action and made to rush at him again, almost in reflex, his face less soft and more enraged now, but his nerves stopped their natural workings to convey the signals of motion to his limbs at the sight of Itaka's shurinan that blazed, a demonic warning on his face. Lightning illuminated his superior's face, and it was drenched in sweat. Upon his countenance was an expression of utmost rage, mingled with his present state of shame that he had been rejected very brutally. Cold air poured into the cave from outside and cooled Itaka's anger. He did not say anything more and saw Miura skitter his hand through his hair in a nervous manner and leave through the cave's mouth to walk into the angry, questing hands of wind. Itaka became more wary after that incident. The man was not to be trusted. Miura was a liability now, and Itaka felt as though he had put that night behind him, but it was not so. At last, that fateful night came, and he ascended, a newborn devil, on the three occupants dozing off after a celebratory night with alcohol and women. Trees circled their abode and closed in night's sentinels. Mist clambered upon their bodies as Itaka opened the door and walked to their supine bodies. Their apparels were expensive and new, grey and white kimonos that bore marks of a skilled cloth maker's designs, faces calm and serene, hair puffy and soft on one side and flat and matted on the other. His footfalls came into the room in silence, and he unsheathed his sword with care, too. One candle cast a sharp light on the bulbous nose of the one snoring rather loudly. Itaka made 3 swishing motions of his arm and cut the necks of careless men. Their eyes opened, expressions caving in with pain, but they had no air in their throats to scream. Their limbs convulsed, light faded from their eyes, unable to see the mess their severed jugular veins had made on their garments and floor, and they died in a quiet and still state right before his eyes. It was over. The mission was done. Itaki had found their abode first by using the only crow he could make. He had sent one to bring Shisui to him. He was not skilled enough to make more than 2 for now. When he reached the meeting place, Miura was furious at his insubordination. He paid him no mind as he knew that a reward awaited him back at the Umbu Corps. His father would be proud, too. Cold nights passed in wait, and Itaka's impatience grew as he waited for his friend to find him. He did not enjoy Miura's lecherous countenance and the bold cast of his gaze. There was a tinge of anger in the yellow of his eyes, and his cheeks wore a mild blush to exhibit his irritation. A storm threatened to sift through the cloud's weak barrier one night when he was offered a drink by his fellow man. The last one had been sent back to the Corps for further instructions, Rafa. He was an unassuming fellow of 16, foolhardy and impressionable, cheeks a vast map of pink freckles that gave an impression to the onlooker that his face was about to boil over. He always appeared baffled around them. The drink was a mild sake, a little tangy on Itaka's tongue. It calmed his nerves and, to his shock, slowed down his nerves signals. His body started shivering mere seconds after he partook a sip. The leather bottle dropped from his loosening grip and fell down. He did not even hear the sound as it met the floor. Strong hands gripped him by the shoulders, and he was made to stand before Miura again. Miura's face was a hazy bundle of lines in his vision. Sweat splashed into Itaka's eyes from his brow, and his stomach burnt with the churning liquid he had sipped. Bumps popped everywhere on his skin, and it shivered, sweaty and clammy. It was so discomforting. His head was floating in the clouds, Sherry non-sleeping despite his pleas for it to claw its way up, like a beast rising from a maw, to his aid. "You have pretty lips, Uchiha, almost like a woman's," Miura whispered and traced Itaka's lips with a rough thumb, his breath hot, rancid on Itaka's face. His words wobbled and blared in his ears. He could barely understand Miura's locution. Rafa grasped his wrists, twisted his arms from the back, and then he was bent forward rather unceremoniously before Miura's loins. A firm hand was placed at the back of Itaka's head to keep him from raising it in protest. Whose hand? He could not say. Sweat dripped off his nose, shivering lips, quivering skin that was in the grip of fear and shame now. The floor was a murky mass by his feet, falling away into the dark ocean beneath in his mind's eye that could not fathom distance any longer. Itaki heard a loud, clattering sound of metal, and he knew Miura had unsheathed his arousal to humiliate him. "Don't please," he said, and his words tumbled, nearly incoherent in the sounds of their rasping breaths. Did they intend to take him by force here, in this old place? He did not understand. Their vulgarity, their boldness. "Sweet little Uchiha," Miura began, and the unnatural rise in his voice was painful in Itaka's ears. "Your father was quick to demand my resignation over a small matter. I never deserved it. I lost everything that day, thrown down into this fucking Umbu gutter post to herd inept boys, day in day out. I wanted to humiliate his son. Give him the shame I've lived through. I didn't want to be sweet on you, but I never expected you to be so lovely. You're a lively one. Stop resisting, and you can enjoy it, too." He grabbed Itaka by the jaw, and his forefinger traversed the soft seam and pushed in to part the lips that curtained his clamping teeth. "Bet your throat is something special hotter and smoother than a woman's," he said, voice husky like a drunkard's as his finger probed the gums and rubbed across Itaka's front teeth and traversed further in to scrape against the tongue. Then Itaka simply fell sideways, his cheek met the wood, and something warm and metallic splashed across his face. It trailed an itchy path to drip down on the dust-caked wood. Creaky sounds filled the room. Then it was quiet again, and a big gloom pervaded the room, its windows bearing streaks of rich life that crawled across the glass to create thin red bars. "Itake, a voice spoke, and it was akin to a whisper for his senses. The face appeared white in the dust, suspended in the air, his vision his friend had found him, and Itake smiled a beautiful smile of relief and joy. When the effects of that accursed drug wore off, Itake felt whole again. His senses, along with the proper functions of his limbs, came back. It was a new morn and its light shone majestically on the cheek of his dear friend, Shisui. He had felled both of them in cold blood, their corpses lay beneath an old cloth, dappled red with signs of violence. He could not say that he was happy with their demise. Was his father unjust to another man? The thought probed his mind more than he had thought possible. When they drew near Konoha's border, Itake asked of Shisui to escort him to the house of Teos. It was so sudden that Shisui halted his steps and turned his back to the moon to face him. His body was dark, a shade, in Itake's sight. "Itake. You're so young," Shisui spoke, a note of astonishment in his voice. His face must have suggested the same, but Itake could not see, and he was not intent to draw out another vision to peer at his countenance. The dark forest spoke all around them in whispers and piteous tones, but his ears were closed off to their calls. "I told you in my letter. It's fine. You didn't say anything then. Why are you stopping me now?" Itake asked, his voice mellow and young. It had not been molded by years to grow deep and rich yet. "I'm not stopping you. It's that," Shisui stopped and ran his hand down the side of his right cheek, "you're still too young for this. I'm sure it isn't something you can't control. Wait for a year, or two, at least. Why don't you take less poison? It's not good for you. This shouldn't." "I've decided," Itake cut across him, his voice a little firmer than before. "It's a distraction, and I want it gone. Besides, my body has matured, and I don't want to create a mess in the clan with another girl. It's better this way." Shisui was silent. He stood amongst the glimpsing dots of fireflies that floated around him upon Dark's garment. Mist's fingers sifted through flora, ghostly assassins, and spread across the ground to hide winter's decaying facade. Smell of rot became intense with the arrival of a whistling wind, and Itake's crunching steps announced to Shisui that he was going there with or without his company. Night was still young and fresh when they arrived at the house of Teos. It was an odd sort of place, richly decorated with the most expensive things. Everything was new here and smelt beautiful. Women, bred from childhood, walked the halls to pleasure men of stature and wealth. Their edifice was one to behold, rich, elusive, lovely. Long hair rested on their buttocks, light makeup enveloped the faces, painted with care, and flowing garments covered their bodies. Itake was enamored to say the least, and such was his curiosity that he requested of Shisui to take him to the woman he had once spoken of. Though fearful of what may come to pass from this decision, he did not deny Itake's request, so he took the boy to the woman who sat in a well-furnished room amongst the sparse light from a lantern and roiling wreaths from incense sticks. A long pipe was clamped between her lips that looked sweeter than honey, and a smile rose tantalizingly to her red mouth. "Shisui-kun," she spoke and licked the black stem, a suggestive gesture as her gaze fell upon Itake's odd expression. Her brows rose, and she smiled at the look that had settled itself firmly on his countenance in its stead now, a cool indifference to hide his true nature. She found that little habit to conceal things endearing. "You have brought a little lamb into the den of the beast." They settled opposite her across a low table, decorated with expensive, feminine things, a comb, pins, and a lovely mirror. She smiled, perfect white teeth showing, and tapped the pipe into a small dish by her knees to deposit the charred contents there. She put a pinch of something at the base of the pipe's bowl and mashed it around there. Itake could only hear crunch-crunch sounds emanate from the pipe. Then she heated it above the candle's kindled flame and inhaled deeply and held that inhalation as long as she could. Hanakoto-san, if you could spare a little time for him, I'd be grateful, Shisui spoke, and Itaka noticed that his tone was inviting, almost different. Hanakoto exhaled in a brief, sigh-like sound, and smoke rose before her beautiful face, hiding it from Itaka's sight. She issued forth a chiming laughter, and her seductive nature came to the fore. He is but a young boy, she paused, drew deep, and exhaled again, and you ask of me to play with him? A little morbid, no, Shisui-kun. That's what he wants, and I've got no issue with his mindset. He's reached sexual maturity, so his age shouldn't be of any concern, he reasoned, appearing a bit flustered under the weight of her gaze. Hanakoto did not look to Shisui but to Itaka this time, and her eyes appraised his face and body with a clear mind and penetrating sight. What a beautiful boy, she spoke, and her voice had the lure of midnight specters. It was lovely, and the ripening boy in him was enchanted by its melody. A little innocent for these chambers. How many seasons have you seen? I turned 12 this summer, Itaka replied and kept his voice firm in an effort to make it deep and commanding, and his dark eyes filled with a sudden something for the first time in his short life. Shisui hung his head in shame. This was not right, but Itaka could not be persuaded otherwise. If Hanakoto turned him down, Shisui would reason with him to quell his passions some other way, but his thoughts had only begun to scale his mind and locate reason when she interposed, "Leave my chamber. He shall stay here, with me, for the night." Surprise was writ large upon Shisui's face, but he forced a smile, muttered something about, "I'll be outside," and then left the room with a resigned disposition, closing the sliding door behind him. Her gaze did not see any worry on Itaka's face, which had previously slipped into its cool mien. She placed the pipe down on the table and tapped her hand on the futon behind her. "Come here and sit with me," she spoke and watched him disentangle the fingers of his right hand from the left one in a smooth, detached manner. Hanakoto shifted back a little to settle herself on the futon and adjusted her garments with thoughtful movements of her pliant limbs. He edged around the table and sat down, a little cautiously, beside her, his gaze settling itself methodically upon the lantern. She placed her hand to his cheek, and then proceeded to glide her fingers along his contours with admiration. "I am a woman of 27, she began and inched closer to take a whiff of his skin. He had no male musk to exude. "I have never had someone so young in my bed. Would it ripen enough to fill me?" She buried her face into his neck, her nose into his lush hair, pressed her lips on his nape, her hand moving down to knead his genitals. The reaction from his body was immediate, but he sought control in its stead. To distract himself, his gaze wandered the room that was filled with antiques, masterworks that hung on the walls. There were shadows everywhere, but his charinon had risen and lust had unveiled, to its full, a beast a red one. Then everything was red in the room, and he had not stopped her from removing the clothes from his torso. His sweaty back lay shivering on the silkiest cake button he had ever felt against his skin. She had located the core of pleasures in his body and placed her mouth on his flesh. It bloomed to a hard state, eager to respond, and he shivered from the tips of his toes to the vibrating, pulsing thing inside her orifice. He could sense his own flesh clearly, mapped by the sweeping motions of her tongue and grazing of her teeth. Itaka could not hear his own sounds that issued forth from his lips in quick successions. His hearing was hampered by a thunderous heart and labored breaths. Her mouth generated pulses of pleasures, the kind he had never known before. An innocent flick of her tongue and a practiced movement of her hand along his length made him spasm. Fluids sprang from the taut crown, and he erupted into her mouth. Hanakoto pulled back with tendrils of his release on her lips. She wiped at her lips and released a girlish laugh. Then Itaka felt a heaviness on his hips, and he strained his head and watched her remove her kimono and reveal her pretty form to his eyes as she sat down on his thighs. Her breasts, with pebbled tips, sat high like plump, ripened fruit, and the decadent curve of her waist extended to her hips flare, and right between her wide-open thighs were coarse black hair to hide her genitals. Along her beautiful shoulders and white forearms ran a red-hot glow from fire like sake. Hanakoto reached over and kissed his throat that was covered in sweat now, and he immediately went erect in her palm. "My, you are a lively boy," she whispered and moved her hand up and down the slick length of him. She had a delicious odor that he so loved now it fanned his lust into a state that, when she bore down on him, red gushed forth into the room that was nothing more than black and white etchings of a bleak painting before. Then autumn moths bloomed from the buds that grew out of red fabrics, their wings vibrating there, and then everything began to pulse in his consciousness in the same rhythm. It was purple, red, and something more ominous that he could not name. Itaka's arousal was silky, thick, hot inside her channel, tight, torrid, a place of dark pleasures. The vibrations from their conjoining made his veins throb with visible pulsations. Her supple organ had swallowed up his pleasure's root. Then he raised a little cry of impatience, his hips heaved, pelvis rose and fell, and he released inside her, and again she squeezed, and again he hardened to experience the vibrations of mating all over again. Itaka did not know how long it went on, his black hair streaked silver with copious amounts of sweat, the lantern's light dimmed in the room, and outside, footfalls passed along the corridor. Incense's scent had diminished and hers had risen to conquer it with hopeless finesse. At last, she bent forward, ground into him roughly, and spilt on his white torso. Her hands, eager in the search of his passions, grabbed hold of his muscle coils and the skin there flushed white. A sudden piercing color invaded her eyes, and her voice broke in the wake of her release. Then she, wordlessly, released him and slowly the excited veins crept back. And a memory had ended like a part of him in this place, a quiet past running down the winding road of wanton pursuits. Standing decadent against the animated lights of many gazes, set in the white spills, wearing clean shadows of a new wood that lay crisscrossed on the fair skin, her flesh was a temple, a sepulchre of all desires. The red kimono was open from the front, and full breasts were bared before the prying eyes, skin flushed with sweat. A thatch of black hair covered the genitals, their smells diminished under the sharp odor of perfumes and airy garb, lighter than silk, sweeter than sake. Fumes rose from the bath and youth went skittering left and right, and the gazes, mad in chase of its taste, skittered, too. Just a little bite, a nip of the nectar brewed by nature that would soon grow stale, wear upon itself words from time. And they would be content. They wanted to writhe and moan, envelop youth's skin, pretty young girls, pretty young boys, beautiful women, beautiful men, ethereal children, as young as 11, with voices lilting, carrying a current of filthy innocence, sullied. They had it all, tomb of lust, grave of desire. Red, much red. A single tooth lodged in the plump lower lip, and the flesh popped there, but common eyes could not see the vividness coming out sake on vibrant lips. She reached a hand through the bars, red in the dew, her fingers fluttering there in heat. Then she sat down, parted the lush thighs wide as though she was meant to in the days of incense and sake, and stretched the right leg that now lay taut from the hips, an inviting smile gracing her lips as delicately as the weightless caresses of fumes. What a filthy place! The silk kimono slipped off her blushing skin as she tilted her head back, intoxicated. The pot's fumes rose, wisps rising from the mouth to envelop the bloom everywhere, a child's toy stippled by foul fingers. Children laughed an older laugh, and one old man sat cringed before a lovely young man, caressing his white foot, which he held in his coarse hand with care. A world unwound behind the wooden frame, street legs sprawling, bird necks stretching, stream veins swelling in earth's flushing skin, pretty dips intensifying below the breathing rib cage of lovely dead bones, twisting backs, turning beds of white peonies, a ruined vestal and a model of stains and flowing crevices, winding and unwinding little toys in many hands. The features cast shadows in the room's deep corners, nothing he had not seen before. One youth made an enticing gesture towards him from the corner of the large house. He was finally beckoned inside. The cover of his strenuous shadow left the frame, and it sighed in its wake. Feet moved behind him, though with the stiffness an old man might possess. One old man nearly grabbed his leg, slurring. He thought him to be a new prostitute, refined in the art of mind and manners. He was mad drunk. He did not stop, feet carrying him through the smoke floating in the air as ghosts, hiding the flesh behind a precarious veil. At last, darkness swallowed up the corridor into its fat belly, and stray shafts from beyond the partition screen slanted in, hitting his eyes with force that red throbbed there in complaint. Chakra exploded in rooms, nooks, corners, children sullied, maidens ruined, men shamed. This house breathed out mourning songs, and still unwound again. And again, but he chose not to heed it and made his way behind the screen. He was glad to see the light's liquid trickle that poured forth from a lantern hanging from a beam above her head as he put the sherry non to sleep. She had put on a show to appear as a single entity in his gaze, all darkness in a single, struggling light's shower. When she became aware of his presence, she wore a curl of dissolute mockery on her fair face. She still looked the same, painted face and chiseled lips colored with the forest berry's touch, black hair scraped back with care and decorated with expensive ornamental pins, and a fan in hand. Over the years, she had not changed much and still looked as remarkably beautiful as the day he first met her. Time had not touched her, caused her grief. He stopped and sat down without a word of greeting. The other man did the same. She found his attitude endearing as her countenance became sweet as though she was dealing with a child. I have not seen you in weeks, Itaka-kun, she spoke in a manner as though her tongue was caressing each word. Sarizawa let out a groan, frowning. He had kept his gaze low. He did not want to raise his eyes and gaze at a few women swaying under the lights, mad somnambulists, black hair swaying against the taut buttocks like loose ink brushes. Nothing covered their flesh and shame. Their shadows danced with light feet on Itaka's left cheek, and he turned his eyes away. A sudden mischievousness flickered in her eyes, and she emitted a laugh, enjoying his cool demeanor. My, I have never seen you flustered by such a tepid show, she spoke, voice light and seductive. Are you flustered? If you are, I miss the sight of a sweet blush on your cheeks. Why have you called me here? Itaki asked, voice a frosty wind in the room's heat, returned her refined exuberance with a tight frown. You are cold, she huffed out in a singing voice and tapped the fan against the lips. Your tongue is sharp enough to slay my heart. I would have loved for you cast aside that garb, play here. With me. A sinister playfulness came into her face, but its intensity was so dimmed in the dark that he did not have the patience in him to gauge its worth. A small child came running to him, and wordlessly, he sat down by his side and touched the inside of his left thigh in a manner that was unfitting of a boy so young. Itaka looked down at him, anger fading at the sight of his innocence. His brow was frowned, and the soft bend of his mouth was quite like Suzuki's. It pained him, heart aching at the sight of him. The boy brushed his small hand against Itaka's thigh again, and he could bear it no longer. Stop playing this game. Get him out of my sight, he spoke, anger invading his tone with the mildest breach. Reminds you of Suzuki-kun, no? Hanakoto spoke, and her smile widened at the predictable rise of red in his eyes. He is so beautiful, too. Not much younger than you when you came to me. You could have been a predator, yet Shisui chose for you to become a prey when you lay beneath me, weeping and moaning as I helped you come. Then she laughed again, and this time, her laughter rippled through the room like a sharp, invading sound. The child scampered away and disappeared behind the women still swaying in the grip of drugs. Leave, Itaka spoke to Sarizawa without turning his head, and he obliged without a word. Seeing this as some sort of invitation, Hanakoto picked herself up, garments and all, and walked to him. Then she sat down delicately by his side, her hand reaching up to tangle in his hair. Why do you not use that cold tongue to warm me? She whispered and strained to press her lips against his throat. He was quicker than her, and in one swift motion her eyes could not see. He had her throat in his grasp, the nails of his thumb and forefinger digging into her jaw. I asked you to complete a task, but you are inept, he spoke and turned his face to look upon her, his cold mien faded, and calm set in that made a chill climb the length of her spine. You were allowed to sell this filth in return for your loyalties. I do not see you trying so hard. Hanakoto blinked, and then her lashes fluttered as his nails broke the white skin to create dents there. I turn a blind eye to these things. On few conditions, yet now you believe yourself to hold all the power. Are you testing me? He asked, and the beauty of his face was no more than an edifice that hid an evil form. No, she let out a small gasp, her gaze trying hard to evade the instruments in his eyes. You are wise, Itaka whispered in a mocking tone, and from this close, she could smell the musk his body gave forth. She always could. A week, that is all you possess. Do not make me come here again without a cause. He pulled his hand back, and she breathed in a shuddering breath. Look what you have done, you have left wounds in my face. I will have to call in a medic to heal these, you rude boy. She smiled a bold smile. Her mouth curved, and she touched the side of his face again. Why are you angry with me tonight? You are pliant when you get intoxicated by that noxious concoction. A different, sweeter man, she spoke, but he did not answer. Instead, he rose to his feet and left the large room in silence. When Itaka made it outside, his eyes fell upon the boy. He was standing before an old man who had a vulgar glint in his eyes. Itaka called to him and he came running. He followed Itaka as he made his way outside the building. Then, as the wind hit him, he went down on one knee and grabbed him gently by the shoulders. In the light of the setting sun, the boy looked so like Sasuke, his mouth was exactly the same. "What is your name?" Itaki asked softly, and the boy eased in his grasp. "Kasuke," the boy said and wiped at his face in a thoughtless gesture. "Where is your family? Are they alive?" he asked and saw the boy shake his head. "Are you from Rain?" The boy, Kasuke, nodded this time. He was so small that Itaka's fingers had the fleshy parts of his arms in his grasp. "Sarizawa, take him to the orphanage in our village," Itaka commanded and watched a smile cross the boy's face. "I have some matters to attend. Tell the elders that the meeting can take place tomorrow. I have no time for it tonight." Then he whispered something and stood up. "Yes, Itaka-sama," Sarizawa replied and held out his hand for the boy. The boy placed his hand in his and watched Itaka disappear into the darkness. He had spoken a name in thoughtlessness, Sasuke. Check the description for the links to the author.